The moment my mother's champagne glass slipped from her fingers and shattered on the marble floor, that's when I knew 15 years of silence had been worth it. But let me take you back 30 seconds. To me, standing in a designer dress no one recognized at the entrance of a 5-star hotel my family had chosen for their annual Christmas spectacle. To my sister Victoria blocking my path with that pitying smile she'd perfected over 40 years. To my mother's voice cutting through the holiday music like a knife, "You're too poor to even buy a roast turkey and you still dare to show your face here." The relatives laughed. They always laughed. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I owned this hotel. I owned the building. I owned the ground they were standing on. And I owned secrets about our family that would destroy everything they'd built on lies. When my head of security walked to that door, bowed his head and said, "Welcome, ma'am. The guests are waiting for you." I watched my mother's face transform from contempt to confusion to something I'd never seen before, fear. This is the story of how I went from the forgotten daughter to the woman who brought an empire to its knees. How I discovered my family's fortune was built on stolen inheritance. How I learned that my perfect sister was as much a prisoner as I ever was. And how revenge almost turned me into the very monster I was fighting. If you think you know where this story is going, you don't. Stay until the end. I promise you the truth is worth it. My name is Sabrina Ortiz, and at 37 years old, I have spent the last 15 years building an invisible empire, while my family believed I was nothing more than a low-level office worker barely scraping by. To them, I am the embarrassment, the daughter who never amounted to anything, the sister who serves as a cautionary tale at family gatherings. They have no idea that the woman they dismiss without a second thought has been watching, waiting, and preparing for this very night. The Grand Westbrook Hotel sparkled with 10,000 Christmas lights as I pulled into the parking lot. Crystal chandeliers visible through the towering windows cast golden light onto the snow-dusted entrance, where valets in crisp uniforms helped guests from luxury cars. My family had chosen this venue specifically because it represented everything they wanted the world to see. Success, sophistication, old money, elegance. Every year they selected a more impressive location for their Christmas gathering. And every year they made sure I knew exactly how much I did not belong. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror one last time. The dress I wore was simple, understated, purchased from a department store that my sister Victoria would never set foot in. My makeup was minimal, my jewelry non-existent. This was intentional. After 15 years of playing a role, I had perfected every detail of the woman they expected to see. The moment I stepped through the main entrance, I felt the familiar weight of judgment settle over me like a heavy coat. Relatives I saw once a year turned to whisper behind their champagne flutes. Cousins who had borrowed money from my parents nudged each other and smirked. I kept my spine straight and my pace steady, walking toward the private ballroom where the Ortiz family held court. My mother spotted me first. Margaret Ortiz, 68 years old, and twice as sharp as women half her age, stood at the center of a circle of admirers like a queen receiving subjects. Her silver hair was swept into an elegant updo, her red dress probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and her eyes tracked my approach with the warmth of a January frost. "Well," she announced, her voice carrying across the marble floor with practiced precision, "look who decided to grace us with her presence." The circle parted slightly, creating an audience for whatever performance was about to unfold. I told Victoria you probably could not afford the gas to drive here, but she insisted we send an invitation anyway. Family obligation and all that. Nervous laughter rippled through the group. I smiled politely the way I had trained myself to smile through 1,000 small cruelties. "Merry Christmas, Mother." She looked me up and down with theatrical disappointment. "Is that what you are wearing? I suppose I should be grateful you are not in sweatpants." She turned to her audience with a conspiratorial sigh. "This one is the reason our family portrait never looks quite right. There is always something slightly off about the composition. Now I suppose you all understand why." More laughter, louder this time. I stood still, letting the humiliation wash over me like waves against a rock. My face burned, but my eyes remained steady. Too steady, perhaps, for someone being publicly dismantled by her own mother. Before I could respond, Victoria appeared at my elbow. My sister had inherited our mother's talent for cruelty, but wrapped it in a veneer of false concern that somehow made it worse. At 41, she was everything I was supposed to want to be successful, married to the right man, mother of a perfect daughter, heir apparent to our family's social throne. "Sabrina, sweetie," she cooed, steering me away from the main gathering toward the VIP entrance. "Maybe you should go home early. You know how Mother gets when she is embarrassed, and honestly, this is supposed to be a celebration. Your presence is making everyone uncomfortable." My mother followed, positioning herself behind Victoria like a general observing a battle. "Your sister is right. Think of the family reputation. Think of what people will say if they see you lingering around like some poor relation begging for scraps." "I am a poor relation," I said quietly. "Is that not what you have always told everyone?" Victoria's smile tightened. "Exactly. So perhaps it is best if you just slip out the back. I will have someone wrap up a plate for you. You can eat it at home alone where you are more comfortable." What neither of them knew, what no one in that glittering ballroom suspected, was that this hotel did not belong to the business network they believed it did. The Grand Westbrook was owned by a holding company called Vance Hospitality Group, which was owned by another company called Meridian Investments, which was owned by a trust managed by a woman named S.M. Vance. A woman who did not exist in any social registry my family would recognize. A woman who was standing right in front of them in a department store dress, being told she was too poor to stay. The head of security approached. I watched my sister's face shift to satisfaction, assuming he was coming to escort me out. Instead, he stopped before me, inclined his head respectfully, and pulled open the VIP door. "Good evening, ma'am. Your table is ready." The hotel manager rushed over, practically stumbling in his haste. "I apologize for any inconvenience you may have experienced," he said, directing his words to me while barely glancing at my mother and sister. "Please allow me to personally escort you. The staff has been expecting you." Victoria's smile did not just crack. It shattered. My mother's champagne glass trembled in her grip, the liquid catching light as her hand shook. Around us, relatives who had been laughing moments ago fell silent, their faces frozen in confusion. I did not explain. I did not gloat. I simply walked through that VIP door without looking back, took my seat at the best table in the house, and let 15 years of patience begin to pay dividends. From across the room, I could feel my family watching me, too proud to ask questions, too confused to enjoy their party. They would convince themselves this was a mistake, a mix-up, some bizarre coincidence. They were wrong. They thought it was a mistake. I knew it was my opening move. The VIP section of the Grand Westbrook offered a perfect vantage point to observe chaos unfolding in slow motion. From my corner table, surrounded by attentive staff who anticipated my every need, I watched my family attempt to salvage what remained of their dignity. It was like watching actors who had forgotten their lines scrambling to improvise a scene they had never rehearsed. My mother recovered first, as she always did. Within minutes of my disappearance behind those gilded doors, she had repositioned herself at the center of her social circle, laughing too loudly at jokes no one was telling, steering conversations away from what everyone had just witnessed. But her eyes kept drifting toward the VIP entrance. Every few seconds, she would glance in my direction with an expression I had never seen on her face before: vigilance. Not contempt, not disappointment, but the careful watchfulness of someone who has suddenly realized they may have underestimated a threat. Victoria handled the situation with considerably less grace. She had retreated to a corner near the bar phone pressed to her ear, fingers flying across the screen between calls. I could not hear her conversations, but I could read her body language perfectly. The rigid shoulders, the way she kept turning away from the crowd, hunching over her device, as if protecting state secrets. She was searching for answers, trying to trace ownership records, calling contacts who might explain how her pathetic sister had somehow commanded respect from a luxury hotel's staff. Her searches would lead nowhere. I had made certain of that years ago. What interested me most was my father. Harold Ortiz sat at the main family table, untouched champagne warming in his hand, staring at nothing in particular. He was not confused like the others. His expression held something different, something that looked almost like recognition, perhaps even guilt. When Victoria approached him, leaning down to whisper urgently in his ear, he simply shook his head and returned to his silent contemplation. He knew something, or suspected something. That realization filed itself away in my mind for later examination. The most telling moment came when Victoria made her way to our mother's side. She leaned close, her voice dropping to barely audible levels, but I had spent a lifetime learning to read my sister's lips and posture. "Mother, what should I do now?" she asked, and in that question I heard everything I needed to know. Victoria, the golden child, the successful lawyer, the woman who had built her identity on being superior to me in every measurable way, was still asking permission from our mother at 41 years old, still seeking guidance like a child lost in a department store. I tucked that observation away with all the others. My dinner arrived course after exquisite course prepared by a chef who had been informed that the owner would be dining tonight. I ate slowly, methodically, performing enjoyment I did not feel. The truth was that everything tasted like ash. I had waited 15 years for this moment. I had imagined it countless times, savoring the fantasy of their shock, their confusion, their dawning realization that they had been wrong about me. I thought it would taste sweet. Instead, I felt hollow. They were finally looking at me, truly looking, probably for the first time in my adult life. But they still did not see me. They saw a threat now, instead of a disappointment. Neither version was actually who I was. I wondered if anyone had ever seen the real Sabrina, or if she had disappeared so long ago that even I could no longer find her. When the evening began winding down, I made my move. I walked to the main family table with measured steps, watching the conversation die as I approached. My mother's smile froze. Victoria's hand tightened around her wine glass. Father continued staring at his plate as if the pattern of the china held answers to questions he was afraid to ask. The silence was suffocating, heavy with unspoken accusations and unanswered questions. I let it stretch for a long moment before speaking. "Next year, sister, you might want to verify ownership before booking venues. It saves embarrassment." Victoria's face drained of color so quickly I thought she might faint. Mother's jaw tightened until I could see the muscles working beneath her carefully maintained skin. Father never looked up. No one asked what I meant. No one dared. I turned and walked away without offering explanation, without gloating, without giving them anything to grasp onto. Uncertainty, I had learned, was far more powerful than revelation. Let them wonder. Let them search. Let them lie awake tonight trying to solve a puzzle missing half its pieces. The drive home took 40 minutes. I parked outside my modest apartment building, the same building I had lived in for 12 years, and sat in the darkness for a long time before going inside. When I finally stood before my bathroom mirror, removing makeup that had served as armor, I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. The mask was off now. Underneath was exhaustion carved into every line of my face. Old wounds that had never properly healed. A question I had been avoiding for 15 years. Is this enough? Will it ever be enough? I had won tonight. I had seen fear in their eyes, confusion in their movements, the first cracks appearing in their certainty. But standing alone in my small apartment, surrounded by the silence of a life built entirely around revenge, I was not sure what victory was supposed to feel like. I only knew it was not this. I did not raise my voice. I raised their fear. That night, sleep refused to come. I lay in my dark bedroom, staring at the ceiling, and found myself drifting backward through time. The memories arrived uninvited, playing behind my closed eyes, like old home movies filmed by someone who had already decided I did not matter. 20 years had passed since I was 17, but some wounds never fully scar over. They just wait for quiet moments to remind you they are still there. I remembered the family photographs that lined the hallways of my childhood home. In every single one, the composition told the same story. Victoria stood at the center, positioned between our parents like the sun around which our family orbited. I was always at the edge of the frame, sometimes partially cut off, sometimes standing slightly behind my sister as if I had wandered into someone else's portrait by accident. When I was 12, I asked my mother why I was never in the middle. She laughed and said the photographer just positioned us that way. But photographers follow instructions. Someone had told them where to put me. Birthday parties painted the clearest picture of my place in the family hierarchy. Victoria's celebrations were legendary affairs catered by professionals, attended by dozens of guests, featuring custom cakes shaped like whatever she was obsessed with that year. When I turned 13, I asked for a small party with a few friends from school. My mother sighed and explained that this was a particularly busy time, that money was tight after Victoria's piano recital and upcoming summer camp. "We're too busy this year, honey. Maybe next year." Next year came with the same excuse, and the year after that. Eventually, I stopped asking. School provided no refuge from the comparison. I remember the evening both Victoria and I brought home report cards during my freshman year of high school. Victoria had earned mostly B's with a single A- in physical education. Our parents studied her grades with serious expressions, then praised her dedication, her improvement in mathematics, her teachers' glowing comments about leadership potential. They promised her a new laptop as reward for her hard work. When I handed over my report card, straight A's in every subject, including 2 advanced placement courses, my mother glanced at it for perhaps 3 seconds. "That's nice, dear," she said, then returned to discussing Victoria's college prospects. I stood there holding a piece of paper that proved I was exceptional, and no one cared. That was the night I understood that excellence would never earn love in this house. The only qualification that mattered was being Victoria. At 16, I discovered a passion that felt like finding oxygen after years of drowning. Business and finance captivated me in ways I could not explain. I devoured library books about investment strategies, watched free online courses about economics, filled notebooks with calculations and projections that my teachers said demonstrated remarkable aptitude. When I finally gathered the courage to approach my mother about college, I had prepared a presentation. Actual slides showing programs I wanted to attend, scholarship opportunities I might qualify for, career paths that could lead to financial independence. My mother listened for perhaps 2 minutes before interrupting. "Sabrina, we only have enough for one college fund, and Victoria needs law school, a prestigious law school which costs significantly more than whatever state university you're imagining. You understand?" I understood perfectly. I was not worth the investment. Over the following months, I watched Victoria receive private tutors, test preparation courses, application coaches who charged more per hour than some people earned in a day. I studied alone at night, teaching myself from borrowed books, dreaming of a future I would have to build entirely without help. The rejection was never about money. There was always money for Victoria. It was about worth, and mine had been calculated at 0. High school graduation arrived on a bright June morning. I walked across the stage to receive my diploma as valedictorian of my class, having earned the highest grade point average in school history. I had written a speech about perseverance and self-reliance that earned a standing ovation from strangers. But when I scanned the audience for my family, searching for faces that should have been beaming with pride, I found only empty seats. They were driving Victoria to a prestigious internship interview 3 states away. "You understand, sweetie," my mother had explained the night before. "Victoria's career is at a critical point. This opportunity could define her entire future." I accepted my diploma from the principal, posed for the official photograph, with a smile that felt like wearing someone else's face, and walked home alone. That night, sitting in my small bedroom surrounded by awards no one would ever celebrate, I made a decision. If they would not invest in me, I would invest in myself. The defining moment came 1 week later. I was walking toward the kitchen for a glass of water when I heard voices and stopped just outside the doorway. My mother was talking to Victoria about college plans, summer schedules, futures bright with possibility. Then Victoria asked about me, and my mother's response carved itself into my memory with surgical precision. "Don't worry about your sister. She'll be fine. Some people don't need much to be happy. She's not like you. She doesn't have ambitions." I stood in that hallway invisible as I had always been and felt something fundamental shift inside my chest. Not anger. Something colder, harder, more useful. Clarity. I was not a daughter to them. I was a backup plan they never intended to use, a spare part kept in storage just in case. From that moment forward, I stopped hoping for their love. I started planning my exit. They did not forget me. They erased me on purpose. 5 years after that moment in the hallway, I finally acted on the clarity it had given me. I was 22 years old, holding a degree I had earned through scholarships and part-time jobs, standing in the foyer of my childhood home with a single suitcase containing everything I owned. The suitcase was small enough to carry with one hand. 22 years of life in this house, and it all fit into something I could lift without effort. That detail told me everything I needed to know about how much space I had been allowed to occupy. My mother appeared as I reached for the door handle. She did not ask where I was going or when I would return. She did not offer money or advice or the name of someone who might help me get started. She looked at my suitcase with an expression of mild inconvenience, as if I were a piece of furniture being removed for reupholstering. "Call sometimes," she said, "for appearances. Not, I will miss you. Not, are you sure about this? Just concern for what the neighbors might think if the forgotten daughter vanished without maintaining the illusion of family connection." My father caught me at the door. He had been sitting in his study, silent as always, but something must have compelled him to move. He hugged me briefly, awkwardly, the way you might embrace a distant relative at a funeral. Then he pressed something into my palm and whispered 2 words that made no sense at the time. "I'm sorry." Before I could ask what he meant, he retreated back to his study and closed the door. I looked down at my hand, a folded $100 bill. It was more than he had ever given me directly, and yet it felt like nothing. I would not understand his apology for many years. At that moment, I only understood that I was leaving with $847 in savings, a worthless degree in general studies, because no one had funded anything more specialized, and the silence of a family that had never truly wanted me. The first year nearly destroyed me. I found a room in a boarding house on the wrong side of a city. I barely knew a space smaller than Victoria's walk-in closet, with a shared bathroom down the hall, and walls thin enough to hear my neighbors screaming at each other every night. I worked 3 jobs to survive, waitressing at a breakfast diner during morning shifts, cleaning office buildings in the evenings, entering data for a medical billing company on weekends. I ate ramen noodles and day-old bread from the bakery that sold its mistakes at half price. I learned which grocery stores discounted produce about to expire and planned my meals around their schedules. Some nights, I was so exhausted that I fell asleep in my clothes, too tired to change. Too tired to cry, too tired to remember why I had thought leaving was the right choice. But somewhere between the exhaustion and the hunger, I discovered something I had never experienced before: freedom. Every decision, no matter how small, belonged entirely to me. Every dollar I earned was mine to spend or save. No one told me I was not worth investing in. No one compared me to a sister who existed in a different universe. I was poor in ways I had never imagined possible, but I was also free in ways I had never dared to dream. The poverty felt terrible. The freedom felt revolutionary. The turning point arrived at the diner where I worked breakfast shifts. An elderly woman named Eleanor Vance came every morning at 7:15, always alone, always carrying the Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal, always sitting at the same corner booth where the light was best for reading. She dressed simply but expensively, the kind of understated elegance that whispered old money to anyone paying attention. She ordered the same thing each day: black coffee, whole wheat toast, a soft-boiled egg. And she always left tips that exceeded the cost of her meal. One morning, she noticed the investment book I was studying during my break. It was a library copy of Benjamin Graham's The Intelligent Investor, dog-eared and highlighted by previous readers who had dreamed the same dreams I was dreaming. Eleanor asked what I thought of Graham's philosophy. That question launched a conversation that changed the entire trajectory of my existence. She had been disinherited by her brothers 40 years earlier, cut out of a family fortune because she was female and therefore considered irrelevant. She had built her own wealth from nothing, brick by brick, investment by investment, until she was richer than the brothers who had dismissed her. She recognized something in me that no one else had ever seen. "I don't give money," she told me that first morning. "Money disappears. I give knowledge. Knowledge compounds." Eleanor became the mother I had never had. She was demanding in ways my real mother had never bothered to be, holding me to standards that assumed I was capable of meeting them. She was brilliant, her mind sharp enough to cut through any excuse or self-pity I tried to hide behind. She introduced me to accountants who taught me to read balance sheets, lawyers who explained corporate structures, investors who had built fortunes through patience and precision. Most importantly, she taught me the rule that would define everything I built: never let them see what you're building. When they finally notice, it should already be too late. I absorbed every lesson. The student was finally ready. The game was about to begin. She gave me what my family never did: belief. Eleanor's belief in me became the foundation upon which I built everything that followed. Over the next decade, I constructed 2 entirely separate lives, each one carefully designed to serve a different purpose. The first life was a performance. The second was the truth, and the distance between them grew wider with every passing year. To my family, I remained exactly what they expected me to be: a failure. I visited once a year, always at Christmas, wearing clothes purchased specifically for these occasions from discount stores and thrift shops. I drove an old car that I kept registered and insured solely for these annual pilgrimages, a vehicle so unremarkable that it confirmed every assumption they had made about my circumstances. When they asked about my work, I offered vague responses delivered with appropriate embarrassment. "Oh, just administrative work at a small office. Nothing exciting. It pays the bills." They nodded with the particular satisfaction of people whose predictions had proven correct. Their pity was almost worse than their contempt, but I endured it because every visit served a purpose beyond maintaining appearances. Each Christmas gathering became an intelligence operation. I listened carefully when Victoria discussed her law firm's expansion plans, memorizing the names of partners and clients she mentioned in passing. I noted which banks my parents used when my father complained about interest rates. I cataloged the business relationships my mother bragged about: the suppliers. Victoria's firm depended on the social connections they believed made them untouchable. They spoke freely in front of me because invisible people are assumed to be deaf. I smiled through their condescension, asked naive questions that prompted revealing answers, and stored every piece of information for future use. They thought they were tolerating a disappointment. They were actually briefing an adversary. In my other life, the real one, I was becoming someone else entirely. S.M. Vance emerged gradually, a name attached to increasingly significant investments, a reputation built on strategic patience and surgical precision. I started where Eleanor had taught me to start: small positions in undervalued assets, penny stocks, that required research rather than capital real estate in neighborhoods showing early signs of gentrification. Every profit was reinvested. Every lesson was absorbed. By my late 20s, I had graduated to something more sophisticated: strategic minority stakes in private companies. The key insight Eleanor had given me was that control was overrated. Owning 51% of a company attracted attention, required disclosure, invited scrutiny. But owning 8% of a critical supplier, 12% of a key lender, 15% of an essential client relationship, that was invisible power. I learned to identify the pressure points in business ecosystems, the relationships that companies depended on, without fully appreciating their vulnerability. I never owned enough to control any single entity. I owned enough to influence many. When the time came, I could apply pressure from directions no one would anticipate because no one knew all the pieces were connected. Maintaining these 2 identities required meticulous separation. S.M. Vance operated through a network of shell companies registered in Delaware, Nevada, and carefully chosen offshore jurisdictions. Everything was legal. I had learned from Eleanor that the difference between wealth protection and tax evasion was documentation, and my documentation was impeccable. I maintained 2 wardrobes, the discount clothes I wore for family appearances and the professional attire required for business meetings conducted under my other name. I kept 2 addresses, the modest apartment where Sabrina Ortiz received mail and a post office box in another state where SM Vance conducted correspondence. I carried 2 phones, 2 email accounts, 2 complete identities that never intersected. When my family occasionally searched for me online, they found exactly what I wanted them to find. Nothing. Sabrina Ortiz had no social media presence, no professional profiles, no digital footprint beyond basic public records showing an address in a forgettable neighborhood. They never thought to search for SM Vance because that name meant nothing to them. Why would their disappointing daughter, the one who answered phones at some small office, have any connection to a rising figure in investment circles? The assumption of my failure was so complete that it never occurred to them to question it. Their contempt became my camouflage. 5 years before that Christmas at the Grand Westbrook, Eleanor passed away peacefully in her sleep. She was 82 years old, sharp until the very end, satisfied that her life's work would continue through the student she had chosen. She left me no money in her will. Instead, she left something far more valuable: her entire network of contacts, her reputation as an introduction that opened doors, and a letter I have never shown anyone. "You're ready now," she wrote. "You've been ready for years. I stayed longer than I needed to because teaching you brought me joy I hadn't expected. But now it's time for me to go and time for you to finish what we started. Remember, revenge is a dish best served profitable. Whatever you do to those people who hurt you, make sure you come out richer. Not just in money, in peace. Don't let hatred poison what you've built. That would be letting them win twice." I read that letter once, memorized every word, then burned it in my kitchen sink. I was 32 years old, financially independent, and completely invisible to everyone who mattered. The network of investments I had assembled touched dozens of companies across multiple industries. The web of connections I had inherited from Eleanor gave me access to information and opportunities that most people never knew existed. And my family still believed I was barely surviving in some dingy apartment answering phones for minimum wage. Phase 1 was complete. Phase 2 was about to begin. They laughed at my clothes. They never saw my balance sheet. The balance sheet they never saw hung on my apartment wall, hidden behind a framed print of a landscape painting that cost $12 at a garage sale. After returning from the Christmas party, I removed the print and studied what I called the map, a complex web of connections I had spent a decade constructing, each thread carefully placed, each node strategically positioned. To anyone else, it would have looked like the work of a conspiracy theorist, arrows and lines connecting company names that seemed to have nothing in common. To me, it was a masterpiece of patient architecture. 7 companies formed the core of my network, each one chosen because of its relationship to my family's ecosystem. The first was Meridian Supply Group, the primary supplier for Victoria's law firm's biggest corporate client. I owned 18%, acquired slowly over 6 years through a holding company that bore no resemblance to my name. The second was First Regional Bank, where my parents held their mortgages and my sister maintained her business accounts. My 12% stake meant little by itself, but combined with a relationship I had cultivated with a sympathetic board member, it gave me eyes on every significant financial decision they made. The third was the hotel chain that included the Grand Westbrook, where I held 15% and had formed an alliance with the majority shareholder, a woman who owed Eleanor a debt she was happy to repay through me. The fourth and fifth were professional service firms, an accounting practice my family trusted with their taxes, and a law firm handling their estate planning. I did not own these outright, but former partners and current associates reported to me before they reported to anyone else. The sixth and seventh were smaller positions in companies that touched my family's lives in ways they never noticed. The catering company Victoria preferred the property management firm that handled their vacation rentals. Individually, these positions looked random. A financial analyst examining my portfolio would see diversification across multiple industries. Nothing remarkable, nothing suspicious. But together, they formed a net that surrounded my family's entire existence. The Christmas hotel had been the most visible piece, a message I had waited years to deliver. The real power lay in the connections they could not see. Victoria's biggest client depended on a supplier that could at any moment change payment terms or delay critical shipments. My parents' comfortable retirement rested on mortgages that could be called in if certain board members decided the risk profile had changed. Their business reputation relied on advisors who answered my questions before they answered anyone else's. I had not built a competing empire. I had embedded myself into theirs like a dormant virus waiting for the signal to activate. Every position had been acquired legally through methods Eleanor had taught me during our years together. I bought during economic downturns when prices were depressed and owners were desperate for liquidity. I built relationships with co-investors who shared my long-term perspective or at least appreciated my willingness to be a patient, silent partner. Most importantly, I never crossed the threshold that would require public disclosure or attract regulatory attention. Ownership under 20% kept me invisible in most jurisdictions. Under 20% meant no filing requirements, no public announcements, no paper trail that a curious family member might stumble upon. They walked through their daily lives completely unaware that every major business relationship they depended on had been quietly infiltrated by the sister they had dismissed as worthless. But sitting alone in my apartment that night, studying the map that represented a decade of careful work, I confronted an uncomfortable truth I had been avoiding for years. Having power and using power were entirely different things. For 10 years, I had built this weapon without ever being certain I would fire it. Part of me, a part I was ashamed to acknowledge, had hoped I would never need to. Some small, persistent voice in my heart had whispered that maybe someday they would see me. Really see me. That they would recognize what they had done, apologize for the years of erasure, and give me the love I had craved since childhood. I had built the capacity for revenge while secretly hoping for reconciliation. That hope died at the Christmas party. I had watched my mother mock me in front of relatives. I had heard my sister suggest I leave to avoid embarrassing the family. I had seen the same contempt in their eyes that had been there 20 years ago, undimmed by time, unchanged by my absence. They were never going to apologize because they did not believe they had done anything wrong. They were never going to see me because they had decided long ago that I was not worth seeing. Nothing I could achieve would change their fundamental belief that I was less than Victoria, less than them, less than enough. So now the question became something else entirely. Not whether I could destroy them because I could. The infrastructure was in place. The weapons were loaded. One phone call could begin a cascade of consequences they would never see coming. The question was what kind of person I wanted to be when the dust settled. Was revenge worth becoming someone I did not recognize? Was justice worth sacrificing the peace? Eleanor had told me to protect. I stared at the map until my eyes burned and I could not answer. I did not build one empire. I planted landmines and waited for them to dance. The question of who I wanted to become haunted me for weeks after the Christmas party. I found myself researching not just my family's business connections, but their history, digging through old records and forgotten documents that Eleanor had taught me to find. What I discovered changed nothing about my plans. But it changed everything about how I understood the woman who had made my childhood a landscape of invisibility. My mother was not always Margaret Ortiz, the formidable matriarch who ruled our family with cutting remarks and strategic cruelty. 40 years ago, she was Margaret Delaney, a poor girl from the wrong side of a small town, working as a secretary in the office where my father's family conducted their business. She was beautiful in the way that threatened wealthy mothers with unmarried sons too pretty to ignore, too poor to approve. When Harold Ortiz announced his intention to marry her, his mother declared war. I found the evidence in letters my father had kept hidden in a safety deposit box I discovered through my banking connections. Letters from his mother to various relatives complaining about the unsuitable girl her son had brought into the family. letters documenting a campaign of humiliation that lasted more than a decade. My grandmother, a woman I barely remembered as a stern presence at holidays before her death, had made my mother's life a carefully constructed hell. Every meal Margaret cooked was criticized. Every parenting decision was questioned. Every social gathering became an opportunity to remind everyone present that Harold had married beneath him, that this interloper would never truly belong to the Ortiz family, no matter how many children she produced. For 10 years, my mother endured. She cooked meals that were never good enough and smiled through dinners where her mother-in-law made pointed comments about her background. She raised 2 daughters under constant scrutiny, every choice examined for evidence of her inferior breeding. She watched her husband fail to defend her choosing peace with his mother over loyalty to his wife. She was the outsider, the intruder, the woman who would never belong, no matter how perfectly she performed the role of devoted spouse. I read those letters and recognized something I had never expected to find: my mother had once been me. When my grandmother finally died of a stroke, my mother inherited control of the household she had served for a decade. She stood at a crossroads that I understood intimately because I had faced a version of it myself. She could break the cycle, refusing to perpetuate the cruelty she had survived, or she could become part of it, transforming from victim to victimizer. The letters stopped after my grandmother's death, but the family dynamics they described continued in new forms. Margaret chose survival over mercy. She told herself she was being strong, that showing any weakness would invite the same abuse she had endured. She decided she would raise daughters who could never be victimized, who would always be on top, who would never feel the powerlessness she had known. But somewhere along the way, strong became cruel. Protective became controlling. The armor she built around herself calcified into a weapon she wielded against her own children. She did not see it happening. Abusers rarely do. The question that had tormented me since childhood finally had an answer. Why Victoria and not me? I had always assumed it was about love, that my mother simply loved my sister more and loved me not at all. The truth was more complicated and somehow more painful. It was not about love. It was about fear. Victoria resembled my grandmother in ways that must have terrified my mother on some unconscious level. She was sharp, ambitious, socially skilled, with an instinct for dominance that emerged early and never softened. By favoring Victoria, by giving her everything and denying her nothing, my mother was appeasing the ghost of the woman who had tormented her. If she kept Victoria happy, perhaps history would not repeat itself. Perhaps the daughter who reminded her of her tormentor would not become a tormentor herself. I found one more document in my research. A letter my mother had written to a college friend never sent, discovered in a box of old correspondence my father had preserved. In it, my mother described her 2 daughters with a candor she never showed in person. Victoria, she wrote, would survive anything because Victoria was built for combat. But Sabrina worried her. She reminds me of myself at that age. My mother had written in handwriting I barely recognized as hers, and I cannot stand looking at that weakness. I have to harden her. The world will be cruel to gentle people. Better she learn that from me than from strangers who will show no mercy. She thought she was preparing me for a cruel world. She was actually just recreating the cruelty she had survived, passing her wounds to the next generation like a genetic disease. The tragedy of it took my breath away. My mother had done to her daughters exactly what was done to her, just in different forms. Victoria was controlled, molded, never allowed to want anything that had not been pre-approved. I was abandoned, dismissed, told I was not worth investment. Both of us were damaged by the same wound our mother carried. And Margaret never recognized it. She genuinely believed she was a good mother, doing her best, preparing her girls for life. I put down the letters and stared at the wall for a long time. Understanding my mother did not mean forgiving her. Knowing the source of her cruelty did not erase its effects, but it complicated the simple narrative of villain and victim I had constructed. She was both. So perhaps was I. She did not raise a daughter. She repeated her own prison and called it love. Understanding my mother's history added layers to a story I had believed was simple. But complexity did not equal exoneration. Whatever Margaret had suffered at the hands of her mother-in-law, whatever fears drove her treatment of her daughters, she had still made choices. She had still caused damage, and as I would soon discover, the wounds she inflicted extended far beyond emotional neglect. Some of her choices had consequences that reached back decades and touched lives I had nearly forgotten existed. The manila envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after the Christmas party. It bore no return address, only a handwritten note in the corner that read, "Delivered as requested." I had commissioned this investigation 2 years earlier through a private firm. Eleanor had introduced me to specialists in recovering documents that powerful people preferred to keep buried. The investigation had taken longer than expected, requiring access to archives that had been moved misfiled or deliberately obscured. But the firm had finally delivered what I asked for: the truth about my maternal grandparents' estate. Inside the envelope were photocopies of 2 documents. The first was the will on file with the county probate court, the official record of how my grandparents' modest fortune had been distributed after their deaths 20 years ago. According to this document, Margaret Delaney Ortiz was the sole beneficiary of an estate valued at approximately $800,000, a sum that had provided the foundation for everything my family built afterward. The language was clear and unambiguous: all assets to Margaret, nothing to anyone else. The second document told a different story. It was a copy of the original will retrieved from the personal files of a retired attorney who had represented my grandparents before his partner took over their account. This version dated 6 months before the official filing divided the estate equally between 2 daughters, Margaret Delaney Ortiz and her younger sister Patricia Delaney. I stared at that name for a long time. Aunt Patricia. I remembered her only vaguely. A smiling woman who had visited when I was very young, who had brought me a stuffed bear that I treasured until it fell apart. She had disappeared from my life so completely that I had nearly forgotten she existed. The original will was clear. Each daughter was to receive half of everything: the house, the savings accounts, the investment portfolio my grandfather had built through decades of careful work. Someone had altered the document before it was submitted to the court. Someone had erased Patricia from her own inheritance. I spent the following weeks digging deeper, using skills Eleanor had taught me and connections I had cultivated over years of careful networking. What I found made the forgery seem almost insignificant by comparison. Aunt Patricia had died in a car accident just 3 months after my grandparents passed away, before she could claim her share of the estate, before she could question why the will differed from what she expected. The accident was ruled mechanical failure: brake lines that had corroded a curve taken too fast, a tree that ended everything. No investigation, no suspicion, just a tragic accident that left Margaret as the sole surviving heir to an estate that should have been split between 2 sisters. I sat with this information for days, turning it over in my mind like a stone I was afraid to look beneath. The timing was convenient, too convenient. My mother had motive, had opportunity, had the kind of cold pragmatism I had witnessed throughout my childhood. But I did not know if she had caused that accident. I did not want to know. Some questions are better left unasked because the answers would require actions I was not prepared to take. What mattered for my purposes was the forged will. That was evidence I could use. That was a thread I could pull without unraveling my own conscience. The notary who had witnessed the fraudulent will was still alive. His name was Bernard Hutchins, and he was 83 years old, living in a nursing home in a town I had never visited. I found him through public records and drove 4 hours to speak with him in person. The man who greeted me in the facility's common room bore little resemblance to the robust signature on 20-year-old documents. He was frail, trembling, with eyes that held the particular weight of someone who has carried guilt for too long. He agreed to speak almost immediately, as if he had been waiting decades for someone to finally ask the right questions. His hands shook as he described what happened in his office 20 years ago. My father had arrived with the altered will, pale and sweating, clearly acting under duress. My mother waited in the car, but her presence was felt in every nervous glance Harold cast toward the window. "Your father signed under pressure," Bernard told me, his voice cracking with age and regret. "Your mother threatened exposure of certain indiscretions. Affairs, I believe. Things that would have destroyed his reputation and his marriage. He was terrified of her. I was paid well to look the other way to notarize a document I knew was fraudulent, to pretend I had witnessed signatures that were forged." He paused, tears forming in eyes that had seen too much and said nothing for too long. "I have regretted it every day since. When Patricia died, I wondered if I had helped cover up something worse than fraud. But I was afraid. Your mother is not a woman who tolerates loose ends." Bernard provided documentation he had kept hidden for 2 decades. Personal notes from that day describing his suspicions, the original signature pages that showed clear differences from the filed versions, a letter he had written to himself explaining everything, in case something happened to me. None of it would be admissible in court on its own. A defense attorney would tear apart the testimony of an 83-year-old man with obvious guilt and possible cognitive decline. But combined with the original will, combined with the suspicious timing of Patricia's death, combined with records I could subpoena if I chose to pursue this legally, it painted a picture that would be difficult to dismiss. I drove home in silence, the weight of what I had learned pressing down on me like a physical force. The house I grew up in, the house where I learned I was worthless, had been purchased with stolen money. Victoria's law firm, the career that had made her the family's golden child, had been capitalized with funds that should have gone to a dead woman's children. My parents' comfortable retirement, their country club memberships, their annual Christmas parties at luxury hotels, all of it traced back to a crime disguised as inheritance. Everything they had built, everything they had used to make me feel small, rested on a foundation of forgery, and possibly something much darker. I had enough now to expose them. A few phone calls to the right attorneys, a few documents shared with the right journalists, and the Ortiz family reputation would crumble. The question was whether I wanted to pull that thread. Exposing the fraud meant exposing my father's cowardice and my mother's calculated cruelty to public scrutiny. It meant involving Patricia's descendants, people I had never met, in a legal battle that could drag on for years. It meant transforming my private revenge into a public spectacle. I looked at the documents spread across my kitchen table and felt the weight of a choice I was not ready to make. I had built my network to wound them. This could destroy them entirely, and I was not certain anymore which outcome I actually wanted. The pen did not lie, but the people holding it did. The documents about my mother's fraud remained locked in a safety deposit box while I decided what to do with them. Some weapons are more powerful when held in reserve, their threat more potent than their deployment. In the weeks following my discovery, I watched and waited, monitoring the ripples spreading outward from the Christmas party through the network of contacts I had cultivated over a decade. What I observed brought me neither satisfaction nor peace. It brought something more complicated, a window into the unraveling of a woman I had spent my entire life envying. Victoria had not slept properly since the hotel incident. This information came to me through her assistant, a young woman named Caroline, who had no idea she was providing intelligence to her boss's estranged sister. We had met at a professional development conference 3 years earlier, and I had cultivated the relationship, carefully presenting myself as a sympathetic ear for the frustrations of working for a demanding attorney. Caroline shared office gossip the way some people share weather observations, casually, constantly, without considering who might be listening. Through her, I learned that Victoria had arrived at work exhausted every morning for 2 weeks, that she had snapped at partners during meetings, that she had hired private investigators to research something she refused to discuss with anyone on her staff. The investigators were chasing ghosts. I knew because I had designed the maze they were lost in. Every trail they followed led to shell companies that led to other shell companies that led to dead ends in jurisdictions with impenetrable privacy laws. They would spend months and thousands of dollars discovering nothing, and Victoria would grow more paranoid with each failed report. But the hotel ownership was only part of what was disturbing her carefully ordered world. Through my positions in her business ecosystem, I had begun applying subtle pressure testing connections, seeing how easily her empire could be shaken. Her primary supplier had requested adjusted payment terms 30 days, instead of 45, citing changes in their own cash flow requirements. A key client had mentioned during a routine call that they had heard concerns about the firm's stability, nothing specific, just whispers that had reached them through channels they could not identify. Her bank had requested additional collateral on existing loans, a standard precaution they claimed triggered by market conditions that had nothing to do with her specifically. Each pressure point was minor deniable, impossible to trace back to a single source. Together they created a feeling of invisible walls closing in, a sense that forces beyond her understanding were moving against her. Victoria was a woman who had always controlled her environment. Now she was discovering how it felt to be controlled by someone else. She called me on a Thursday evening 2 weeks after Christmas. I was preparing dinner in my modest kitchen when my phone displayed her name, a rare occurrence that immediately told me something had changed. Victoria never called me. In 40 years of sisterhood, I could count our phone conversations on both hands. I let it ring twice before answering, keeping my voice neutral, betraying nothing. "Sabrina." She said my name like an accusation. "I need to ask you something." "Of course, Vicky. What is it?" "Have you heard anything strange about my company? Anyone asking questions about me or the firm?" I performed ignorance with the skill of long practice. "I work in a small office, Vicky. I do not know anything about corporate matters. Why would anyone be asking me questions about your firm?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. I could almost hear her recalibrating, searching for the angle she had missed. "I do not know. I just thought maybe someone had reached out to you. It is probably nothing." What she could not see was my smile. What I noticed was something more interesting than her paranoia, the sound of her voice. Victoria had always spoken to me with a particular tone, a mixture of condescension and impatience that made every conversation feel like an interruption of her more important life. That tone was absent now. In its place was something closer to uncertainty, perhaps even fear. And when she paused, waiting for my response, I realized something else had changed. The deference was gone from my end of the conversation. The slight tremor that had always crept into my voice when speaking to my successful sister, the unconscious submission I had never been able to fully control, had vanished. I sounded calm, confident, perhaps even amused. For the first time in 40 years, the dynamic between us had shifted. Victoria must have noticed too, because her next words came more carefully, almost tentatively. "Emily has been impossible lately. 17 and thinks she knows everything, keeps talking about being her own person, about not wanting to follow the path I have planned for her." She paused, and when she continued, her voice was strange, almost fragile. "She reminds me of—" The sentence hung unfinished between us. "Reminds her of whom?" Of me, the sister who had escaped expectations by being deemed unworthy of them, of herself at that age before our mother had molded her into the acceptable daughter. The silence stretched for 3 heartbeats before Victoria cleared her throat and changed the subject, asking about my holiday plans with the forced casualness of someone retreating from accidentally exposed territory. I filed the moment away for future consideration. Victoria's daughter Emily, the teenager I had seen only in photographs, might become important later. Not as a weapon against my sister, but perhaps as a mirror, a reflection of choices Victoria had never been allowed to make. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen and thought about the woman on the other end of that call. The Victoria I had known my entire life was a fortress, impenetrable, superior, utterly certain of her place in the world. The Victoria I had just spoken to was something else. She was afraid. She was confused. And somewhere beneath the armor she had worn since childhood, cracks were beginning to show. I would learn later what happened after our conversation ended. Caroline told me weeks afterward, sharing details she had pieced together from observations and overheard conversations. Victoria had sat in her home office for hours that night, surrounded by awards and diplomas that suddenly seemed to mock rather than validate her. She had pulled a small box from the back of her desk drawer, a container she kept hidden from everyone, including her husband. Inside were artifacts from a life she had never been permitted to live. Acceptance letters to art schools she had been forbidden to attend, sketches from a talent our mother had deemed impractical, a faded photograph of a young man whose name she still remembered, whom our mother had called unsuitable and systematically removed from her life. Victoria had held those relics of abandoned dreams and felt something she had spent decades suppressing, grief for the person she might have become if she had been allowed to choose her own path. Then she had closed the box, quickly ashamed of her own sentimentality, and returned it to its hiding place. But the crack was there now, widened by stress and sleeplessness and the unsettling feeling that her carefully constructed world was built on foundations she did not fully understand. I could not have known all of this that night. But I sensed it in her voice, in the unfinished sentence about her daughter, in the absence of the contempt that had always defined our relationship. Victoria was beginning to unravel, and I was not certain how I felt about watching it happen. She feared losing what she had never truly earned, including herself. The cracks in Victoria's armor were widening faster than I had anticipated. Within a month of our phone conversation, the subtle pressures I had positioned throughout her business ecosystem began converging into a crisis she could not ignore. I had not caused any single event that followed. I had simply arranged the landscape so that when she stumbled, there would be no one to catch her fall. The first domino fell on a Monday morning in late January. Victoria's largest supplier, a logistics company that handled distribution for her firm's most important corporate client, sent notice that they were renegotiating payment terms. Effective immediately, all invoices would require payment within 15 days instead of the standard 45. The letter cited changing market conditions, increased operational costs, the need to improve cash flow across their entire client base. Victoria would have recognized these as standard corporate justifications that meant nothing and everything simultaneously. What she could not know was that this decision had been made during a board meeting the previous week, proposed by a director who owed his position to the support of a strategic minority shareholder named S.M. Vance. The timing was surgical. Victoria's firm operated on tight margins with cash flow carefully managed around predictable payment cycles. Suddenly requiring 3 times the liquid capital to maintain the same supplier relationship created an immediate crisis. She needed bridge financing, and she needed it fast. Her usual banking contacts, influenced by concerns I had quietly seeded about market instability in her sector, offered terms she could not accept. She was trapped between operational necessity and financial impossibility. As if by miracle, a solution appeared. An investment firm she had never heard of contacted her office offering bridge financing with terms that seemed almost too good to be true. The interest rate was reasonable. The repayment schedule was flexible. The representatives were professional, knowledgeable, and eager to help a firm with her track record of success. Victoria was desperate and relieved in equal measure. She did not research the firm as thoroughly as she should have. She did not read the fine print about change of control provisions that would trigger if certain performance metrics were not met. She signed the agreement within a week, grateful that someone had thrown her a lifeline without understanding that lifelines can also become leashes. I watched from a distance, monitoring the situation through contacts and public filings, feeling something I could not quite name. The investment firm was legitimate. The terms were legal. Victoria had made a choice based on incomplete information, but the information she lacked was not hidden, merely overlooked. She had been careless because she was desperate, and she was desperate because I had arranged circumstances to make her so. The trap was not a lie. The trap was a truth she had not been careful enough to verify. My mother fell into a different kind of snare. Margaret had always prided herself on financial acumen, believing that her survival of poverty and her navigation of my grandmother's hostility had given her superior judgment about money. When a financial advisor contacted her with an exclusive investment opportunity, she was primed to listen. The advisor came with excellent references, including a recommendation from someone in her social circle whose opinion she trusted. The opportunity was emerging market bonds, a sector showing strong short-term returns, with what the advisor described as manageable risk. The investment was entirely legitimate. Nothing about the offering was fraudulent or deceptive. The bonds existed. The returns were possible. The risks were disclosed in documents my mother chose not to read carefully because she was convinced she already understood what she was doing. What the advisor did not emphasize, what the documents mentioned only in technical language my mother would not parse, was that these particular bonds were concentrated in sectors my own analysis suggested would decline significantly within 6 months. Economic indicators, policy shifts, market trends that anyone paying attention could have identified pointed toward trouble. I had not created the bad investment. I had simply ensured my mother would hear about it at the moment when her pride and her greed would override her caution. She invested 60% of her retirement savings, eager to prove she still understood money better than the professionals who managed her accounts. When the bonds lost value, and they would lose value, she would have no one to blame but herself. I had not placed the trade. I had not lied about the opportunity. I had merely pointed the way toward a cliff she chose to approach on her own feet. Through all of this, I maintained my cover with meticulous care. I visited my family occasionally, wearing the discount clothes and driving the old car that confirmed their expectations. I answered their condescending questions about my insignificant job with the vague deflections that had become second nature. When Victoria mentioned her business stress, I offered sympathetic platitudes that meant nothing. When my mother bragged about her new investment opportunity, I nodded and said it sounded interesting. They looked at me and saw what they had always seen. The family disappointment, harmless and irrelevant, too simple to pose any threat. But behind my mask, I was calculating timelines and monitoring developments with cold precision. I knew when Victoria's loan payments would come due. I knew when my mother's bonds would likely begin their decline. I watched financial news for the indicators that would trigger the cascades I had arranged. I was not pushing anything. I was simply waiting for gravity to do its work on structures I had quietly undermined. When Victoria's supplier had squeezed her, I had not caused it. I had just ensured no one intervened to offer better terms. When my mother's investment collapsed, I would not have created the loss. I had just pointed her toward an opportunity she was predisposed to mishandle. Late at night, alone in my apartment, doubt crept in despite my best efforts to keep it at bay. I lay in darkness and asked myself questions I did not want to answer. Was this different from what they did to me? They had neglected me, passively, damaged me through absence rather than presence, destroyed my childhood through what they chose not to do rather than what they did. My revenge was equally passive. I was not attacking them directly. I was simply removing the safety nets that might have caught them stepping aside so their own choices could carry them toward consequences. Was passive revenge any different from passive neglect? Eleanor's letter echoed in my memory, the words I had burned but never forgotten. Do not let hatred poison what you have built. I looked at my reflection in the dark window and wondered if I was building justice or becoming the monster I had spent my life fighting. The woman staring back at me offered no answers. She looked tired. She looked hard. She looked like someone whose moral clarity had begun to blur around the edges. I pushed the doubt aside and went to sleep. But it did not disappear. It waited patient as I had been patient for the moment when I would be forced to confront it. I did not push them off the cliff. I just opened the door and they walked through. The door remained open for 6 months. I watched from the shadows as my family walked through it step by step, each choice bringing them closer to the edge I had prepared. When they finally fell, the collapse happened faster than I had imagined, more completely than I had planned, and with an emotional impact I had not anticipated. I had spent 15 years engineering this moment. I had not spent a single day preparing myself for how it would feel. Victoria's destruction began on a Tuesday in July. The market conditions I had predicted 2 years earlier materialized exactly as my analysis had suggested, creating a perfect storm for companies overextended in her sector. Her biggest project, a corporate restructuring that had consumed 18 months of work and represented the future of her firm, collapsed when the client declared bankruptcy. The fees Victoria had counted on evaporated. The reputation she had staked on the project's success crumbled. And the investment firm that had provided her bridge financing 6 months earlier saw an opportunity they had been waiting for. The contract Victoria had signed in desperation contained provisions she had not read carefully. Performance metrics that seemed achievable when she signed had become impossible in the changed market. Default clauses triggered automatically when certain thresholds were missed. By the time Victoria arrived at her office that Tuesday morning, the transfer of ownership was already underway. She found new board members waiting in her conference room, people she had never met asking questions about operations and client relationships with the confident authority of people who now controlled 40% of everything she had built. By noon, she was no longer CEO. The board meeting was brief, professional, and devastating. The new stakeholders had identified leadership concerns. They appreciated her years of service. They were certain she would understand the need for fresh perspective during this challenging transition. By evening, she had been offered a consultancy role that everyone in the room knew meant nothing, a face-saving gesture that allowed them to claim they had not simply discarded the woman who had built the firm from nothing. 30 years of work, 3 decades of sacrifice and ambition, and carefully constructed success gone in 8 hours. My mother's devastation arrived more quietly but cut just as deep. Her quarterly investment statement appeared in her email inbox on a Wednesday afternoon, a routine communication she had received dozens of times before. But this statement was different. The emerging market bonds she had invested in so confidently 6 months earlier had performed exactly as economic indicators had suggested they would. The portfolio had lost 70% of its value. Her retirement savings, the cushion she had counted on to maintain her lifestyle for the remaining decades of her life, had been reduced to a fraction of what she needed. She called her financial advisor immediately, her voice escalating from demanding to threatening to nearly hysterical as the conversation progressed. She screamed about fraud and misrepresentation. She threatened lawsuits and regulatory complaints. She insisted that someone had deceived her, that the risks had not been properly disclosed, that she could not possibly have agreed to something so catastrophic. The advisor responded with the calm professionalism of someone who had dealt with angry clients before and had documentation to protect himself. He reminded her politely but firmly that she had signed all required disclosures. He quoted from their recorded conversations in which he had recommended diversification. He noted that she had explicitly rejected his advice, insisting that she understood the market better than he did. "You should have diversified, Mrs. Ortiz," he said finally. "We discussed this multiple times. I have records of every conversation. You made an informed decision based on information I provided. I am sorry the investment did not perform as you hoped, but the risk was clearly communicated." She hung up without responding. The loss was not just financial. It was the final destruction of her self-image as a brilliant woman in control of her destiny. She had survived poverty and persecution. She had navigated the treacherous waters of her mother-in-law's hostility. She had built a family empire through cunning and determination. And now she had lost most of her retirement savings because she had been too proud to listen to advice, too arrogant to acknowledge that her judgment might be fallible. The money could potentially be recovered over time. The illusion of her own superiority was gone forever. What happened next revealed something about my family that I had always suspected but never witnessed directly. Faced with crisis, they did not unite. They turned on each other with a ferocity that shocked even me. Victoria blamed my mother for not leveraging her social connections to provide better options during the financing crisis. If Margaret had called in favors, if she had introduced Victoria to the right people, if she had done anything besides sit in her comfortable house and judge from a distance, the collapse could have been avoided. My mother blamed Victoria for being too stupid to avoid obvious traps for signing contracts without reading them, for proving that all the investment in her education and career had produced a woman who could not recognize danger when it was handed to her with a bow. My father sat in his study and watched through open doors as his wife and daughter tore each other apart. He said nothing. He offered no defense of either woman. He simply observed with the passive resignation of a man who had spent his entire adult life avoiding conflict, letting others fight battles he was too weak to join. The family that had once presented a united front against me, the coalition that had made me feel excluded and worthless for decades, had no unity left. They were just three wounded people discovering that their bonds had been transactional all along, maintained by success and dissolved by failure. I learned about most of this through my network of contacts, through Caroline's office gossip and financial records I could access through my positions. But some of it I witnessed directly. One evening I drove past my childhood home, the house where I had learned I was invisible, the house that would soon need to be sold to cover debts and losses. I parked across the street and sat in darkness for over an hour, watching lights turn on and off in windows that had once enclosed my loneliness. I saw my mother's silhouette pass behind the living room curtains. I saw my father's study light burn late into the night. I imagined Victoria somewhere inside, perhaps in her old bedroom, contemplating the wreckage of everything she had worked for. These were the people who had made me feel worthless. These were the people I had spent 15 years preparing to destroy. They were destroyed now, or close to it. I had won. So why did victory taste like ashes in my mouth? I had wanted them to suffer as I had suffered. They were suffering. I had wanted them to understand what it felt like to be dismissed and abandoned. They were learning. But sitting in my car outside the house where my childhood had been erased, I felt no satisfaction, no joy, no sense of justice finally served. I felt only a profound emptiness, a hollow space where triumph should have lived. "Is this enough?" I asked the darkness through my windshield. The darkness offered no answer. It never does. Their ladder had finally snapped. I held the rope and could not decide whether to throw it. The emptiness followed me home from my childhood street and settled into my apartment like an unwelcome guest. For 3 days I moved through my routines without feeling anything, going through motions that had lost their meaning. I had achieved everything I planned. The victory I had engineered for 15 years was unfolding exactly as designed, and I had never felt more hollow in my life. Then my father called, and everything I thought I understood about my past collapsed into rubble. He contacted me through my personal phone, the number I had kept unchanged since leaving home in case of emergencies that never came. His voice was hesitant, almost frightened, as if he expected me to hang up the moment I recognized who was calling. He asked if we could meet somewhere private, somewhere away from the family, somewhere no one would see us together. The request was so unusual, so completely outside the pattern of our non-relationship, that I agreed before I could think of reasons to refuse. He chose a small coffee shop in a town 30 miles from anywhere either of us lived, a place where we would be strangers to everyone around us. I arrived first and selected a corner booth where we could speak without being overheard. When he walked through the door, I barely recognized him. My father had always been a background figure in my life, present, but passive there, but never truly engaged. The man who approached my table looked like someone had taken that distant figure and drained him of whatever substance had remained. He was diminished in a way that went beyond the normal effects of age. He moved like someone carrying a weight that had finally become too heavy to bear. He sat across from me without speaking. His hands trembled as he placed them on the table, and I noticed age spots I did not remember seeing before, wrinkles that mapped decades of silence and regret. For a long moment he simply looked at me, studying my face, as if searching for something he had lost years ago. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a manila envelope, sliding it across the table toward me with the careful deliberation of someone handling something precious and dangerous. I opened it without asking what it contained. Inside were bank statements yellowed with age, documenting an account I had never known existed. The account was in my name, opened when I was 18 years old. The statements showed deposits made over 4 years, small amounts that would not attract attention. $200 here, $300 there, the careful accumulation of someone who was hiding money from someone else. The final balance transferred out of the account in a lump sum on my 22nd birthday was just over $25,000. "This was yours," my father said, his voice cracking on the second word. "I saved it from household money bit by bit in amounts your mother would not notice. I transferred it to you when you turned 22, right before you left home." My world tilted sideways. I remembered the mystery money that had appeared in my bank account the month I moved out, the unexpected balance that I had assumed was some kind of error, some bureaucratic mistake I was afraid to question in case they took it back. That money had given me the runway to survive my first desperate months of freedom. It had allowed me to pay rent while working 3 jobs to eat while I saved to have a cushion that made the difference between drowning and merely struggling. Every investment I had made, every position I had built, every piece of the empire I had constructed over 15 years traced back to that initial capital. And it had come from him. "I could not stop what she was doing to you," he continued, tears forming in eyes that had witnessed my erasure and said nothing for decades. "I was too weak, too afraid of her. I watched her dismiss you, ignore you, treat you like you did not matter, and I did nothing to intervene. I am not asking you to forgive that. There is no forgiveness for what I allowed to happen, but I could not do nothing at all. So I did this, the only thing I was brave enough to do." I stared at the bank statements, trying to reconcile this revelation with the narrative I had constructed about my past. In my story, I had escaped alone. I had built everything from nothing. I had survived despite my family, not because of any help they provided. Learning that my foundation rested on my father's secret support changed something fundamental about how I understood my own journey. He was still speaking words tumbling out as if a dam had finally broken after years of pressure. "I have watched you from a distance. I know you became something extraordinary. I could not tell anyone, especially not your mother, because she would have found a way to take it from you. She would have demanded you return the money, or used it as leverage, or found some way to make your success about her failure. So I stayed silent. I let you believe you had done it alone, because that was safer than letting her know you had help." He paused, struggling with what came next. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "And I know what you are doing now. To them. To us." I froze, every muscle in my body going rigid. How much did he know? What had he figured out? My carefully constructed separation between Sabrina Ortiz and SM. Vance had been designed to be impenetrable. Had I made a mistake somewhere? Had he been watching more closely than I realized? "I do not know the details," he continued as if reading my fear. "I do not need to know. I just see the patterns, the timing of Victoria's troubles, the investment your mother made that went so wrong, the way everything seems to be collapsing at once. I may be weak, Sabrina, but I am not stupid. I understand cause and effect." He reached across the table as if to take my hand, then stopped, uncertain whether touch would be welcome. "I do not blame you. They deserve it. I deserve it. I should have protected you, and I failed. I should have stood up to your mother, and I could not. I should have been your father instead of a ghost in your childhood, and I was too much of a coward. Whatever you decide to do, however far you want to take this, I will not stop you. I will not warn them. I just wanted you to know before the end that you were not completely alone." Not entirely. Someone was watching. Someone cared, even if that someone was too weak to show it. The question that mattered most forced its way out of my throat despite my efforts to hold it back. "Why did you not just take me with you? Why did you not leave her?" His answer was devastating in its simplicity. "Because I am weak, Sabrina. I have always been weak. Your mother saw that in me 40 years ago, and she has used it ever since. I needed her strength the way some people need oxygen. Without her telling me what to do, what to think, who to be, I do not know if I would exist at all. That is not an excuse. It is just the truth. The pathetic, shameful truth about who I am." He finally let his hand fall on mine, his grip weak and trembling. "I am not asking for forgiveness. I am just asking you to remember when this is over, that I was silent, but I was not absent. And please, Sabrina, whatever you do next, do not let this turn you into her. I sat in that coffee shop for an hour after he left, staring at bank statements that rewrote my history. I had spent 15 years believing I owed my family nothing. Now I learned I owed them everything, at least the foundation of it, and the debt came from the last person I would have expected. He was silent for 20 years, but his silence saved me, and that truth was harder than his betrayal. My father's revelation haunted me for weeks after our meeting. The foundation of my self-made narrative had cracked, revealing something more complicated beneath. I had built my identity on the belief that I owed my family nothing, that every success was mine alone, that I had risen from their ashes through pure determination. Learning that my father had secretly provided the seeds of my empire forced me to reconsider everything. But I did not have long to process this internal upheaval. The external collapse I had engineered was accelerating, and soon my family would come to me in ways I had imagined for 15 years but never truly prepared for. The deterioration happened faster than I expected. Collection agencies began calling the family home daily, their automated messages and aggressive representatives a constant reminder of debts that could not be paid. The mortgage company sent notices that escalated from reminders to warnings to final demands printed on paper that practically screamed urgency. Victoria's husband, a man I had met perhaps a dozen times over the years and never thought much about, filed for divorce within weeks of her losing control of her company. He had married success and ambition. He had no interest in sharing failure and disgrace. The speed of his departure suggested he had been waiting for an excuse, perhaps planning his exit for years, and Victoria's collapse simply provided the justification he needed. The social consequences were equally swift and equally brutal. Friends who had surrounded my family at countless parties, who had laughed at their jokes and accepted their invitations, and basked in the reflected glow of their status, stopped returning phone calls. Country club memberships that had defined their identity for decades were quietly allowed to lapse. Invitations to events they had once anchored dried up entirely. The social circle that had given them worth, that had made them feel superior to people like me, evaporated as if it had never existed. They discovered what I had always known: their friendships had been transactions, not relationships, and transactions end when one party can no longer pay. In desperation, they did the unthinkable. They came to me for help. Not because they valued me or had suddenly recognized my worth as a human being. They came because they had exhausted every other option. They had borrowed from everyone willing to lend. They had sold what could be sold quickly. They had begged from relatives who had always envied them and were now enjoying their downfall too much to offer assistance. I was the last resort, the forgotten daughter they had dismissed for decades, the only person left who might possibly have resources they could access. The irony of this reversal was not lost on me. My mother arrived first, appearing at my modest apartment without warning on a Thursday afternoon. I opened the door to find her standing in the hallway, dressed in clothes that were expensive, but no longer new, her makeup carefully applied, but unable to hide the exhaustion beneath. She had rehearsed what she was going to say. I could tell by the way her words came out too smoothly, too polished, with the artificial cadence of someone reciting lines they had practiced in front of a mirror. "Sabrina, dear." She began, her voice carrying a warmth I had never heard directed at me before. "I know we have not always been as close as we should have been. But family is family, and I was hoping we could talk." She looked past me into my small living room with an expression that mixed curiosity with barely concealed disdain. "You have always been so good with money. Simple living, saving what you earn, not wasting resources on unnecessary things. I admire that about you." Even in desperation, she could not resist a subtle insult. Simple living, not wasting resources. The implication that my modest existence reflected limited means rather than deliberate choice. I let her into my apartment and listened as she continued her rehearsed appeal, watching her perform humility the way a student performs a role in a school play, technically correct, but fundamentally unconvincing. We have hit a rough patch, she continued, settling onto my second-hand sofa with visible discomfort. Temporary difficulties that will resolve themselves in time. I was hoping you might be able to help with a small loan, just enough to bridge us through this difficult period. You would be repaid, of course, with interest. I know how important financial arrangements are to you. When she finished speaking, I let silence fill the space between us. I watched her grow uncomfortable, watched her rehearsed confidence begin to falter, watched her realize that I was not going to make this easy. Finally, I asked the only question that mattered. What did you give me when I needed help? She blinked, caught off guard. What do you mean? When I was 22 years old and leaving home with nothing. When I was working 3 jobs and eating ramen because I could not afford real food. When I spent years building something from nothing while you told everyone I was a disappointment. What did you give me then? Silence. She had no answer because the answer was nothing. Not a dollar, not a kind word, not even a phone call on my birthday to acknowledge I existed. Why should I give you anything now? She left without receiving an answer to her request. I told her I would think about it. The words tasted strange in my mouth, neither yes nor no, a purgatory of uncertainty that I knew would torment her. Victoria came separately 2 days later, having apparently received a report from our mother about how her appeal had gone. My sister arrived without her usual armor of confidence and superiority. She looked like someone who had not slept properly in weeks. Her eyes red-rimmed, her hair less perfectly styled than I had ever seen it. When I opened the door, she started crying almost immediately. Please, she said the word I had never heard from her lips before. Please, Sabrina, I am about to lose everything. My home, my savings, my reputation. Richard is leaving me. My own daughter barely speaks to me anymore. Do you have any idea what that is like? I considered her question carefully before answering. Actually, I do. I lost everything when I was 22. The difference is that I had no one to beg, no family to call, no safety net to catch me, no sister to ask for help, and somehow I survived, built something from the wreckage, made a life worth living. I paused, letting the words settle. Maybe you will too. Her tears transformed into anger so quickly I could see the shift happen behind her eyes. Then the anger collapsed back into pleading desperation, overriding pride-need, overwhelming resentment. She begged in ways I had never imagined Victoria capable of begging. She made promises she could not keep. She offered apologies that might have been genuine or might have been strategic. I could not tell the difference, and I was not certain it mattered. I gave her the same answer I had given our mother. I would think about it. And then, I let them wait. Hours stretched into days. Days stretched into weeks. They called, and I did not answer. They texted, and I responded only with brief acknowledgments that committed to nothing. They hovered between hope and despair, not knowing whether help would come, not knowing if I was considering their requests or simply enjoying their suffering. For the first time in their lives, they understood what powerlessness felt like. For the first time, they experienced the particular torture of waiting for someone else to decide your fate. I knew the cruelty of what I was doing. I did it anyway. And late at night, unable to sleep, I discovered that revenge tasted like cold coffee, and bitter regret nothing like the satisfaction I had imagined. I finally heard the words they never gave me please. It should have felt like victory. The hollow feeling of hearing them beg stayed with me through sleepless nights and distracted days. I had waited 15 years to see them brought low, to watch them experience the powerlessness I had known my entire childhood. Now that it was happening, I felt nothing like satisfaction. But I had set wheels in motion that could not be stopped, and while I wrestled with the emptiness of incomplete revenge, I made a decision about the documents locked in my safety deposit box. I did not need to destroy my family. I just needed to release the truth and let it do the work for me. The children of Aunt Patricia were not difficult to find. My investigation into the forged will had uncovered their existence 2 cousins I had never met, now adults with families of their own, living in states far from where we had grown up. Their mother had died before they were old enough to understand what they had lost. Their father had remarried and moved on, never suspecting that his first wife's inheritance had been stolen before she could claim it. These cousins had grown up without the money that should have been theirs, money that had instead funded my family's comfortable existence, Victoria's career, my parents' retirement. I sent an anonymous package to an attorney I had identified through careful research, a lawyer known for taking cases involving estate fraud, someone with a reputation for both tenacity and discretion. The package contained copies of the original will. The forged version filed with the court Bernard Hutchins' personal notes and correspondence, and a summary of the timeline that made the fraud impossible to ignore. I included contact information for Patricia's children, now the rightful heirs to half an estate that had been stolen 20 years ago. I did not sign the package. I did not include any way to trace it back to me. I simply provided truth and let justice find its own path. The lawyer, sensing both a righteous cause and substantial fees, moved quickly. Within 2 weeks, a lawsuit was filed against my mother and father, alleging fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to deprive legal heirs of their inheritance. Within a month, local news outlets had picked up the story. The headlines wrote themselves, "Prominent family accused of inheritance fraud. 20-year deception uncovered in estate case. Forged will allegedly stole fortune from rightful heirs." The scandal spread through my family's social circle faster than fire through dry brush, consuming the reputation they had spent decades cultivating. The depositions revealed everything. Bernard Hutchins, now 83, and unburdened by the prospect of consequences he would not live to face, provided testimony that was both detailed and devastating. He produced the documentation he had kept hidden for 2 decades, handwritten notes describing the pressure he witnessed, the payments he received, the guilt he had carried every day since. His testimony alone might have been dismissed as the confused memories of an elderly man, but it was not alone. My father was subpoenaed as a witness, compelled by law to answer questions under oath. I was not present for his deposition, but I obtained the transcript through channels Eleanor had taught me to cultivate. Reading his words was like watching a man dismantle himself piece by piece. He confirmed that he had signed the altered will under pressure from his wife. He described the threats she had made: exposure of affairs, destruction of his career, the end of everything he had built. He admitted that he had known the document was fraudulent when he signed it, that he had participated in stealing from his sister-in-law's memory and her children's future. His voice, according to notes from those present, broke multiple times during questioning. Historical bank records showed suspicious transfers in the months following my grandparents' deaths. Forensic document experts identified inconsistencies in the signatures on the filed will, subtle differences in ink composition and paper aging that suggested alterations made after the original document was created. What had begun as circumstantial suspicion became damning evidence. The case against my parents was no longer about disputed memories or competing interpretations. It was about documented fraud. My mother refused to testify, pleading the Fifth Amendment on advice of her attorney. In a criminal case, such silence cannot be held against a defendant. But this was a civil matter, and her refusal to answer questions spoke volumes. Every time she declined to respond, she might as well have been confessing. The jury of public opinion needed no further convincing. Margaret Ortiz, the woman who had built her identity on superiority and control, had been exposed as a thief, and possibly worse. The social devastation that followed surpassed even the financial losses. Friends who had surrounded my family for decades did not merely distance themselves. They actively shunned anyone associated with the scandal. Invitations that had already dried up became explicit exclusions. The country club where my parents had been members for 30 years quietly revoked their membership, citing conduct unbecoming. The church community where my mother had once organized charity events fell into awkward silence whenever she appeared, congregants suddenly discovering urgent business elsewhere. Neighbors who had once sought my parents' approval now crossed the street to avoid eye contact, treating them like carriers of a contagious disease. Victoria suffered collateral damage that cut even deeper than her own financial ruin. Her ex-husband's divorce attorneys seized upon the scandal, arguing that association with accused criminals demonstrated poor judgment that should affect custody arrangements. Richard won full custody of their daughter Emily in proceedings that were reported with barely concealed glee by local media hungry for every detail of the family's collapse. But Emily, now 18 and legally an adult, made her own choice. Rather than live with a father who had abandoned her mother at the first sign of trouble, she moved into a small apartment alone, declaring independence from both parents and the toxic legacy they represented. I noted her decision with interest. Victoria's daughter rejecting the family that had shaped her, choosing to build something of her own. The parallel to my own journey was impossible to ignore. Throughout the exposure, no one suspected me. Why would they? I was the family failure, the invisible daughter, the woman without resources or connections or any apparent means of orchestrating such a comprehensive destruction. When lawyers for both sides questioned me as part of their investigations, I answered every question with complete honesty. I did not forge the will. I did not file the lawsuit. I did not speak to reporters or provide information to journalists. I had not contacted Patricia's children or their attorney. Every statement I made was technically true. I simply failed to mention that I had arranged for truth to find its audience, that I had placed evidence where it would be discovered by people motivated to use it. My family blamed each other for the exposure. They blamed business rivals who might have benefited from their downfall. They blamed former friends who might have harbored secret resentments. They blamed lawyers and journalists and the cousin plaintiffs they had never met. They blamed everyone except the quiet woman watching from the margins, the daughter they had taught to be invisible, the sister they had dismissed as irrelevant. Their inability to see me had always been their greatest weakness. Now it was their final blindness. Documents spilled more blood than knives ever could, and I never held the blade. The blade I never held cut deep enough to sever everything my family had built. In the months following the exposure, the legal process ground forward with the slow inevitability of a glacier carving through stone. Depositions led to motions. Motions led to hearings. Hearings led to a trial that lasted 3 weeks and ended with a verdict that surprised no one who had been paying attention. The court ruled definitively the original will was valid. The filed will was fraudulent, and partial restitution was ordered to Patricia's heirs, the cousins I had never met who were finally receiving what should have been theirs 20 years ago. The financial judgment alone would have been devastating. Combined with Victoria's business collapse, my mother's investment losses, legal fees that had accumulated like compound interest on a debt that could never be repaid, and the divorce settlement that stripped away what little remained of the family's liquid assets, the verdict triggered a cascade that ended at the only asset large enough to satisfy the creditors, the house. The bank filed foreclosure proceedings within weeks of the judgment. Auction signs appeared on the front lawn like tombstones marking the death of everything my parents had pretended to be. The neighborhood that had once envied the Ortiz family now watched through parted curtains as a once proud dynasty packed their lives into cardboard boxes. I drove by on moving day not to gloat, but to witness. I needed to see this chapter close with my own eyes, to stand at the grave of my childhood and confirm that it was truly dead. I parked across the street in the same spot where I had sat months earlier, watching lights turn on and off in windows that held no warmth for me. The house looked different in daylight, smaller than the fortress it had seemed when I was young, shabbier than the monument to success it had represented in my memories. Paint peeled near the gutters. The lawn showed patches of brown where care had been neglected in recent months. The tree in the front yard, the one where I used to sit and read alone because no one inside wanted my company, had grown wild and overgrown, its branches reaching toward windows like fingers grasping for something lost. My bedroom window was visible from where I sat. The smallest window in the house facing the parking strip rather than the garden, offering a view of asphalt and passing cars, rather than the landscaped beauty the other bedrooms enjoyed. I had spent countless hours staring through that glass, dreaming of escape, imagining a future where I mattered to someone. Now the window reflected only empty gray sky, the room behind it stripped of furniture and memory, just another space being vacated by people who had never understood what they possessed or what they had thrown away. My mother sat on the front porch, amid furniture that would not fit in whatever small apartment awaited her. Chairs and tables, and decorative pieces that had once announced wealth and taste, now looked like the sad remnants of a garage sale no one wanted to attend. She stared at nothing, her hands folded in her lap. Her posture collapsed in a way I had never seen. This was not the formidable woman who had ruled our household with cutting remarks and strategic cruelty. This was not the matriarch who had made me feel worthless with a glance. This was a defeated old woman whose empire of pride had finally crumbled, leaving nothing but rubble and regret. I watched her for a long time, waiting to feel satisfaction. What came instead was something more complicated, something I could not name. Victoria emerged from the house directing movers with what dignity she could muster. Her clothes were practical rather than fashionable, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, her face bare of the careful makeup that had once been her armor. She supervised the loading of boxes and furniture with the efficiency of someone who had learned to function through crisis, her voice steady even as her world continued to collapse around her. At some point, she noticed my car. Her eyes found mine across the lawn, across the distance that had always separated us across 40 years of competition and contempt and carefully maintained hierarchy. I expected hatred. I expected accusation. I expected the curl of her lip that had always accompanied her acknowledgement of my existence. What I saw instead stopped my breath. Her expression held something new, something I had never seen directed at me: recognition. Not suspicion, not blame, but the dawning awareness of seeing another person clearly for perhaps the first time. As if the scales had finally fallen from her eyes and she was perceiving her sister as an actual human being rather than a supporting character in her own story, a bit player whose purpose was to make Victoria's starring role shine brighter. She gave a small nod, almost respectful. Almost an acknowledgement that I existed, that I mattered, that whatever I had become deserved recognition rather than dismissal. Then she turned back to the chaos of moving day, directing a mover who was handling a box marked fragile with insufficient care. It was not an apology. It was not forgiveness or understanding or any of the things I had once dreamed of receiving from my family. But it was acknowledgement. After 40 years of invisibility, it was something. I learned later what I could not have seen from my car inside the house. Another drama was unfolding. Emily, Victoria's 18-year-old daughter, stood alone in her grandmother's old room, looking at wallpaper that had been there since before she was born. The room that had once belonged to Margaret, the command center from which my mother had orchestrated our family's dynamics, was empty now except for dust and faded rectangles where pictures had hung for decades. Emily had refused to go with her father, the man who had abandoned her mother when trouble arrived. She had refused to follow her mother into whatever diminished future awaited. She had chosen something I recognized from my own history: independence. At 18, Emily was moving into a cheap apartment across town, taking a gap year before college, working a retail job to pay rent, determined to build something that belonged entirely to her. She had watched her family implode and decided she wanted no part of the wreckage or the rebuilding. She wanted to start fresh, to define herself by her own choices, rather than by the legacy of people who had failed her in different ways. She did not know me. We had never spoken beyond the superficial exchanges of family gatherings I had attended in disguise. But she was making the same choice I had made at 22, stepping away from a family that had disappointed her, reaching for a future she would have to construct alone. I watched her emerge from the house, carrying a single bag, her possessions apparently as minimal as mine had been when I left. She walked past her mother without stopping, past her grandmother without looking, heading toward a used car parked at the curb. The cycle that had run through my grandmother to my mother to me was reaching for another generation. Whether Emily would break it or continue it remained to be seen. But she was trying. That counted for something. I started my car and drove away before anyone else noticed me. The house grew smaller in my rearview mirror until it disappeared entirely, just another building on a street full of buildings, holding secrets that would fade when the new owners painted over the wallpaper and replaced the memories with their own. Walls do not remember the pain they witnessed, but the people inside never forget. The memory of Emily walking away from her family's wreckage stayed with me in the weeks that followed. I saw myself in her determination, recognized the particular set of her shoulders, as she chose independence over the comfort of familiar dysfunction. I wondered if she would find her own Eleanor, her own path through the wilderness of building something from nothing. I wondered if the cycle would finally break with her generation, or if it would simply reshape itself into new patterns of damage. These thoughts occupied my mind when Victoria called and asked to meet, not to beg for money or blame me for her destruction, but simply to talk. Something in her voice told me this conversation would be different from any we had shared before. We met at a coffee shop. Neither of us had ever visited neutral territory in a city that suddenly felt too small to contain our complicated history. I arrived first and chose a corner booth where we could speak without being overheard, a habit I had developed during years of conducting business I preferred to keep private. When Victoria walked through the door, I barely recognized her. The sister I had known my entire life had been defined by careful presentation, perfect hair, immaculate makeup, clothes that announced success before she spoke a word. The woman approaching my table wore simple jeans and a sweater that looked like it had been chosen for comfort rather than impression. Her face was bare, her hair pulled back carelessly, her posture lacking the rigid confidence I had always associated with her presence. She looked exhausted. But beneath the exhaustion, I noticed something unexpected: peace. As if losing everything had freed her from something heavy, some burden she had been carrying so long, she had forgotten it was there until it was finally lifted. "Thank you for coming," she said, sliding into the booth across from me. "I was not sure you would." "I was not sure either," I admitted. "But I am here." She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup a waitress had placed before her, drawing warmth from the ceramic. For a long moment, she simply looked at me, studying my face as if seeing it for the first time. Then she spoke. "I need to tell you something. Not as an excuse for how I treated you. Not as justification or explanation or any attempt to make myself look better. Just the truth, because someone should know before it is too late, and you are the only person who might actually understand." I waited, saying nothing, giving her the space to continue. Everyone always assumed I was the chosen one, the favorite. The daughter who had everything handed to her while you were pushed aside. That is how it looked from the outside. That is probably how it felt to you. She paused, gathering herself. But that is not how it was. Not really. I was never chosen, Sabrina. I was controlled. Every single moment of my life. The confession poured out like water through a broken dam, decades of suppression finally giving way to truth. She told me about wanting to study art, about the sketchbooks she had filled as a teenager with drawings that teachers said showed genuine talent. She told me about the day she showed our mother her acceptance letter to an art school, the dream she had nurtured in secret, the future she had imagined for herself. Our mother had laughed, then grown serious, then delivered the verdict that would shape the next 30 years. Art was for people without real options. Victoria was going to law school, where she would build something respectable, something that reflected well on the family, something Margaret could brag about at social gatherings. "You think I wanted to be a lawyer?" Victoria asked, her voice carrying an edge I had never heard before. "I have hated every day of that career, every case, every client, every hour billed. But it was what she wanted, so it was what I did." She told me about Richard, the husband who had just divorced her, the man I had always assumed she chose for his wealth and status. Our mother had found him, approved him, arranged the introduction, and orchestrated the courtship like a director staging a play. Victoria's role was to perform interest, then affection, then love, convincing enough to satisfy an audience of relatives and friends. She had never loved Richard. She had never chosen him. She had simply played the part assigned to her year after year until the performance became indistinguishable from reality. "I never got to choose anything," she said, and her voice broke on the word. "Not once. Not ever. My career, my husband, my friends, even my hobbies. Everything was curated by Mother to build the image she wanted the world to see. I was not her daughter. I was her project. her proof that she had succeeded where her own mother-in-law said she would fail. I sat in stunned silence as the implications washed over me. All those years I had envied Victoria, hated her for being chosen, resented the attention and resources that flowed to her while I was ignored. And she had been just as trapped as I was, just in a different kind of cage. "You were jealous of me." The question escaped before I could stop it, the idea so foreign that I could not quite grasp it. "Every single day," Victoria admitted. "You were invisible to them. Yes, that was painful. I watched you suffer from it and I did nothing to help. But invisible means free. You could fail privately, make mistakes no one noticed, figure out who you were without an audience judging every step. I was visible every moment, scrutinized every moment, corrected every moment. Every choice I made was evaluated against Mother's expectations. Every deviation was punished subtly, but certainly. You got to leave and build your own life. I was trapped performing in a play I never auditioned for, reading lines someone else wrote, playing a character I did not recognize. For the first time in 40 years, I saw my sister not as the enemy who had enjoyed our mother's favor at my expense, but as a different kind of prisoner. We had both been damaged by the same woman, shaped by the same dysfunction, broken in complementary ways. I had been erased. Victoria had been consumed. Same cage, different bars. "I know what Mother did to you was cruel," Victoria continued. "I participated in it. Every Christmas dinner where I joined in the mocking. Every family gathering where I treated you like an embarrassment. That was my role, the favored daughter who looked down on the forgotten one. I hated myself every time I did it. But admitting that would have meant admitting my whole life was a performance. That nothing I had achieved was real. That the person everyone saw was a character created by someone else. I was not ready to face that." She looked at me with eyes that held tears but did not let them fall. "I am ready now. Losing everything showed me what should have been obvious years ago. I had nothing real to begin with. The career was hers. The marriage was hers. The success was hers. I was just the actress who brought her script to life." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "You at least built something true. Something that belongs entirely to you. I never had that. I never even knew I was allowed to want it." I did not forgive her. The years of cruelty, the participation in my erasure, the complicity in making me feel worthless could not be undone by a single conversation, however honest. But I understood. And understanding, I discovered, hurt more than hatred. Hatred was simple, clean a wall I could hide behind. Understanding required acknowledging that the world was more complicated than I had allowed myself to see, that the people I had cast as villains were also victims, that my mother's damage had radiated outward in directions I had never imagined. I spent 20 years hating the wrong person. The real enemy was the woman who broke us both. The revelation that Victoria had been as much a prisoner as I was reshaped everything I thought I knew about my family. We had both been broken by the same woman, twisted into complementary shapes of damage that had kept us from ever truly seeing each other. I left that coffee shop with a head full of questions and a heart that no longer knew what to feel. The hatred that had sustained me for decades now seemed misplaced, aimed at a fellow victim, rather than the architect of our shared suffering. But there was no time to process these complications. The legal case that would determine my mother's fate was reaching its conclusion, and I found myself drawn to witness the final act of a drama I had set in motion. The courtroom was sparsely attended on the day of closing arguments. The scandal that had consumed local news cycles for months had faded from public attention, replaced by fresher outrages and newer controversies. The spectators who remained were mostly legal professionals observing for educational purposes, a few journalists fulfilling obligations to follow stories through to their conclusions, and distant relatives whose stake in the outcome justified the inconvenience of attendance. I sat in the back row, unnoticed, just another observer in a room full of people who had no idea how thoroughly I had orchestrated what they were watching. My mother sat at the defendant's table, and I almost did not recognize her. The woman I remembered from my childhood had been formidable, commanding a presence that filled any room she entered and bent it to her will. The woman before me now had aged dramatically in the months since the scandal broke. Her hair, always perfectly styled, hung limp and gray. Her posture, once ramrod straight with confidence, had collapsed into the curved spine of defeat. Her eyes, which had cut me with glances throughout my childhood, stared at the table before her with the empty gaze of someone who had already accepted the verdict before it was announced. She was 70 years old, and looked 90, diminished by circumstances into someone barely recognizable as the matriarch who had ruled my family for decades. My father took the witness stand for the prosecution. I had known he would testify, had anticipated this moment since the case was filed, but watching it unfold still carried an impact I had not expected. He recounted the events of 20 years ago in a voice that cracked repeatedly, describing how Margaret had pressured him to sign the altered will, how she had threatened to expose affairs he had conducted during their marriage, how she had made clear that his compliance was the price of maintaining the comfortable life he had grown accustomed to. He spoke of living with guilt for 2 decades, of knowing he had participated in theft and fraud, of watching his wife spend money that belonged to her dead sister's children without ever acknowledging the crime that had made it possible. Throughout his testimony, he never once looked at my mother. She sat motionless at the defendant's table, staring straight ahead, offering no reaction to the husband who was systematically destroying any remaining defense she might have mounted. Whatever partnership had existed between them, whatever alliance had held their marriage together through decades of shared secrets, had finally shattered under the weight of consequences neither had anticipated. Bernard Hutchins appeared via video testimony from his nursing home, his face filling a large screen mounted for the court's benefit. At 83, he was frail and trembling, but his mind remained sharp enough to provide detailed testimony about the day he had notarized a fraudulent document. He produced the personal notes he had saved for decades, handwritten records of his observations and suspicions, documentation he had created as insurance against exactly this kind of reckoning. His account corroborated everything my father had said and added details that painted an even more damning picture of calculated deception. Other witnesses followed in careful sequence. Bank employees testified about suspicious transfers that had occurred in the weeks following my grandparents' deaths. Distant relatives described conversations with my mother in which she had made statements inconsistent with the official version of the inheritance. Forensic document experts presented technical analysis showing inconsistencies in the will on file with the court, variations in ink composition, anomalies in paper aging, subtle differences in handwriting that suggested alterations made after the original signing. The case against my mother was built methodically, brick by brick, until the structure of her deception stood fully exposed. Her attorney attempted to discredit the testimony as faulty memory and motivated accusation. He suggested that elderly witnesses were unreliable, that family members had reasons to lie, that forensic analysis was subject to interpretation. The judge listened with the patience of someone who had heard similar arguments many times before and found them unconvincing. When the defense finished its closing statement, the silence in the courtroom suggested that everyone present knew how this would end. The verdict came swiftly. The original will was declared valid, the filed will fraudulent. Full restitution was ordered to Patricia's heirs, the cousins I had never met, who were finally receiving what should have been theirs 20 years ago. My mother was not criminally charged because the statute of limitations on forgery had long since expired. But the civil judgment was devastating. Damages were assessed in amounts that far exceeded any resources she had remaining. Combined with legal fees, court costs, and the debts already accumulated from Victoria's business collapse and her own investment losses, the judgment represented complete financial ruin. The practical effect was simple and absolute. My mother would die in debt. Whatever years remained to her would be spent in the shadow of obligations she could never satisfy. The legacy she had fought so hard to build, the reputation she had constructed through decades of social climbing and careful image management, had been reduced to a cautionary tale about greed. Future generations, if they remembered her at all, would remember the fraud rather than the success it had purchased. I watched her leave the courtroom with the shuffling gait of someone who had finally been broken. I felt no triumph. I felt no satisfaction. I felt only the strange emptiness that had accompanied every stage of this revenge, the hollow space where victory should have lived, but somehow never arrived. 3 weeks after the verdict, a check arrived at my apartment. It was my share of my grandparents' estate, calculated according to the original will that had finally been restored, delivered 20 years after it should have reached me. The amount was modest, far less than I had earned on my own through the empire I had built. In purely financial terms, it was insignificant, a fraction of what I could have made in a single successful investment. But I held that check for a long time, understanding that its value had nothing to do with the number printed on its face. This check was acknowledgement. Official recognition that I existed, that I mattered, that I had always been meant to be included in a family that had tried to erase me. My name had been restored to a document where it had been deliberately removed. The legal system had declared in language that could not be disputed that I was a legitimate heir, a rightful descendant, a person whose existence could not be denied or diminished. The money itself was almost irrelevant. What mattered was the validation it represented. I deposited the check and watched the numbers appear in my account. The wounds of my childhood did not heal. The scars remained exactly where they had always been. But something shifted inside me nonetheless. Some weight I had not known I was carrying finally set down. Justice was written in ink. But freedom, I was learning, has to be written by hand. The freedom I was learning to write by hand proved more difficult than any document I had ever drafted. In the months following the verdict, I found myself in unfamiliar territory, a life without a clear enemy, to fight a future without revenge, to plan days that stretched forward without the structure that hatred had provided for 15 years. I had achieved everything I set out to accomplish. My family was ruined. The truth had been exposed. Justice had been served. And I had no idea what to do with myself now that the war was over. 3 months after the courtroom verdict, my mother appeared at my apartment door. I had not seen her since the trial, had not spoken to her since the day she came begging for money that now seemed like a lifetime ago. The woman standing in my hallway bore little resemblance to either the formidable matriarch of my childhood or the desperate supplicant who had asked for loans. She looked frail in a way I had never seen before, and I knew immediately that this frailty was not performance. My mother had spent decades manipulating through apparent weakness when it suited her purposes. This was different. This was genuine diminishment, the kind that comes when the body finally begins to fail, and no amount of willpower can disguise it. She coughed as I let her in, a persistent rattling sound that she dismissed with a wave of her trembling hand. "It is nothing," she said, the same words she had used to dismiss my childhood needs, my teenage dreams, my adult existence. But now they referred to her own decline rather than my irrelevance. Her hands shook slightly as she accepted the cup of tea I offered, age spots and prominent veins marking skin that had once been smooth with expensive creams and careful maintenance. She moved to my second-hand sofa with the careful steps of someone who no longer trusted her own balance. "I moved into an apartment," she said, as if this information might interest me. "Small, 1 bedroom. Harold's pension covers most of it. Victoria visits when she can, which is not often. She is trying to rebuild something, I think. Starting over." She looked around my modest living room with eyes that held no judgment, only observation. "You live simply. I never understood that. Now I am learning what simple means." I said nothing, waiting for whatever had brought her to my door. The woman who once presided over a household with servants and gardeners and cleaning staff now heated canned soup for dinner alone. The woman who had hosted elaborate parties and judged everyone who attended them now spent her evenings in a 1-bedroom apartment with furniture salvaged from the house she had lost. Time had extracted payment for decades of cruelty, and the bill had come due all at once. "I was cruel to you," she said finally, the words emerging without preamble or preparation. "I know that now. Maybe I always knew. Maybe I just could not admit it to myself because admitting it would have meant facing what I had become. She paused, struggling with what came next, her hands wrapped around the teacup, as if drawing courage from its warmth. I need to tell you about my life, not as an excuse. There is no excuse, but because you deserve to understand even if understanding changes nothing. She told me about her youth, filling in details I had discovered through investigation, but had never heard from her own lips. The mother-in-law who had despised her from the moment Harold brought her home, who had spent a decade reminding Margaret that she was not good enough, would never be good enough, had married above her station through tricks and manipulation, rather than genuine worth. She described years of humiliation at family gatherings, meals where every dish she prepared was criticized parenting decisions that were overruled, and mocked a husband who loved her, but was too weak to defend her against his own mother. When she finally died, I swore I would never be weak again. Never let anyone make me feel small again. Never raise daughters who could be victimized the way I had been victimized. Her voice cracked, decades of suppressed emotion finally breaking through the walls she had built. I thought if I was hard on you, you would become strong. I thought neglect would build character, would teach you to rely on yourself, rather than on people who would only disappoint you. I told myself I was protecting you from a cruel world by showing you cruelty early. She set down her teacup with hands that would not stop trembling. But I was not protecting you. I was just reenacting what had been done to me. I became the person I hated. I looked at you and saw my younger self vulnerable and soft and everything I could not afford to be anymore. And instead of protecting that softness, nurturing it, celebrating it, I crushed it. Because looking at you reminded me of what I had lost, what your grandmother had beaten out of me through years of relentless cruelty. Tears were streaming down her face now, and I realized with a shock that I had never seen my mother cry. Not once in my entire life, not at funerals or during arguments or in moments of stress that would have broken most people. The tears falling down her weathered cheeks were perhaps the first genuine emotion I had ever witnessed from her, the first crack in armor she had worn so long it had fused with her skin. I do not expect you to forgive me, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I would not forgive me. What I did cannot be undone. The childhood I stole from you cannot be returned. The years of feeling invisible and worthless, the damage I caused, the wounds I inflicted, none of that can be healed by an apology. She forced herself to meet my eyes. But I needed you to know before whatever time I have left runs out, it was not your fault. You did not fail me. I failed you. Every single day of your childhood, I failed you. And I am sorry. More sorry than words can possibly express. The silence that followed her confession stretched long enough to become uncomfortable, then long enough to become something else entirely. I sat with her words, turning them over in my mind, examining them for manipulation or hidden agenda or the subtle cruelty that had characterized so many of our interactions. I found none. For the first time in my 40 years, my mother had spoken to me with complete honesty. I hear you, I said finally. For the first time in my life, I actually hear you. I believe that you mean what you are saying. I believe that you understand what you did. I paused, gathering words for what came next. But hearing is not forgiving. Believing is not absolving. I am not ready to forgive you. I may never be ready. The damage was too deep, lasted too long, shaped too much of who I had to become to survive. My mother nodded slowly, accepting the limitation I had placed on what this conversation could achieve. I understand. I would not expect anything else. She rose to leave, moving toward the door with the careful steps of someone conserving energy for essential tasks. At the threshold, she paused and turned back to look at me one final time. Whatever you built, however you became the person you are, I am proud of you. She held up a hand to forestall any response. I know I have no right to be. I did nothing to help you, gave you nothing to work with, created only obstacles and wounds. But I am proud, nonetheless. You survived me. You transcended me. You became something I could never have imagined." She opened the door. "That is more than I ever achieved." She left without waiting for a response. I sat in my quiet apartment as the sound of her footsteps faded down the hallway, and I felt something shift inside me. Not resolution, not forgiveness, not the closure that stories promise but life rarely delivers. Just the beginning of something. A door starting to close on a room I had lived in too long. Sorry does not rebuild childhoods. But sometimes it closes doors that needed closing. The door my mother's apology had begun to close did not swing shut immediately. It remained ajar for weeks, letting in drafts of complicated emotion I had no framework to process. I had spent so long defining myself in opposition to my mother that discovering she was more complex than the villain I had constructed left me uncertain about my own identity. If she was not simply evil, what did that make me for destroying her? If her cruelty had roots in her own suffering, did that change anything about the damage she had caused? These questions circled without resolution until a letter arrived that pushed them aside entirely, introducing a new complication I had not anticipated. The envelope bore no return address, but the handwriting inside identified the sender immediately. Emily Ortiz. Victoria's daughter, the 18-year-old who had walked away from her family's wreckage to build something of her own. She had found me through public records, she explained, tracking down an address for the aunt she had heard whispers about, but never really known. She was living independently now, working retail while figuring out her life, and she wanted to meet. Not for money, not for family connection in any traditional sense. She wanted advice from someone who had done what she was attempting: escape a toxic family and build something from nothing. I agreed to meet her, curious about this girl whose choice to leave had echoed my own departure so many years ago. We arranged to meet at the coffee shop where I had spoken with my father, a location that was becoming a confessional for broken families, neutral ground where Ortiz's secrets could be shared without the weight of ancestral walls pressing down. When Emily walked through the door, I saw immediately why Victoria had once mentioned that her daughter reminded her of someone. Emily moved with the particular confidence of a young person who has decided to trust herself because no one else has proven trustworthy. Her eyes scanned the room with sharp assessment before finding me in the corner booth. She was 19 years old and already carried herself like someone who had learned that the world would not give her anything she did not take for herself. She was hungry in ways I recognized from my own youth, hungry for knowledge, for guidance, for someone to tell her that the path she had chosen was not insane. She asked questions that cut straight to the heart of what she needed to know. How did I build something from nothing? What were the first steps? How did I survive the years when everything seemed impossible? I found myself answering with enthusiasm. I had not expected drawing on Eleanor's wisdom, translating decades of experience into lessons a 19-year-old could apply. It felt good to teach. It felt meaningful to pass on what had been given to me to pay forward the mentorship that had saved my life. We met again the following week, and the week after that, and the week after that. Each conversation deepened our connection. Emily absorbed everything I shared with the desperate attention of someone who knows that knowledge is the difference between drowning and swimming. She reminded me of myself at that age before Eleanor had smoothed my roughest edges when I was all determination and hunger and barely contained rage. I saw in her the potential for everything I had become, and I wanted to help her reach it faster than I had with less suffering along the way. But gradually, without noticing at first, something shifted in what I was teaching. The practical advice about investing and patience and long-term thinking gave way to something harder, colder. I heard myself telling her that she needed to be stronger than the people who had hurt her, that she should never let anyone see her pain, that she did not need anyone, that relying on others was weakness that would be exploited. I was teaching independence, but I was also teaching isolation, wrapping lessons in armor that would protect her from connection as effectively as it protected her from harm. The turning point came during our fourth meeting. Emily was describing a conflict with a coworker, someone who had criticized her work in front of customers. She was handling it the way I had taught her, cold, detached, refusing to show that the criticism had affected her. Then she quoted something I had said weeks earlier, repeating it with the pride of a student demonstrating mastery of difficult material. Family is just people who share your DNA. They do not deserve anything just because of blood. She smiled as she said it, pleased with herself for internalizing the lesson, for building the wall I had encouraged her to build. You taught me that. It helps me not care what my mother thinks anymore. I heard the words as if someone else had spoken them. The coldness, the dismissiveness, the absolute rejection of connection disguised as wisdom. Where had I heard that particular hardness before? The answer came like ice water poured down my spine. I had heard it in my mother's voice, the woman who had convinced herself that cruelty was preparation for life, that hardness was strength, that teaching her children to expect. Nothing was protecting them from disappointment. Every piece of wisdom I had been sharing with Emily was emotional armor, indistinguishable from emotional abandonment. I was teaching her to survive by teaching her to shut down, to disconnect, to build walls so high that nothing could hurt her, but nothing could reach her either. I ended our meeting early that day, claiming an appointment I did not have. Emily looked confused but accepted my excuse, promising to call later in the week. I drove home with hands that trembled on the steering wheel, my mind racing through every conversation we had shared, every lesson I had imparted, every piece of myself I had transferred to this hungry young woman who trusted me to guide her toward something better. That night I stood in my bathroom and looked in the mirror. The face staring back at me was not the face I expected to see. It was my mother's face. Not the defeated old woman who had apologized in my living room, but the younger version, the one I remembered from childhood, the one who had confused hardness with strength and justified cruelty as preparation for a cruel world. I had spent 15 years carefully constructing revenge against that woman, and somehow, without noticing, I had become her. The realization hit with physical force. I had been grooming Emily not for freedom, but for revenge. I had been creating a weapon to use against Victoria, shaping her daughter into the same kind of cold, disconnected survivor. I had become someone who would reject her mother as thoroughly as I had rejected mine. I had been perpetuating the cycle that destroyed my own childhood, passing trauma to the next generation, exactly as my mother had passed it to me. The pattern I had recognized in Margaret, the generational curse of wounded people wounding others, was not something I had escaped. It was something I was actively continuing. The nausea came suddenly and overwhelmingly. I made it to the toilet before I was sick, my body rejecting what my mind had finally understood. This was not who I wanted to become. This was not the legacy I wanted to leave. Everything I had built, everything I had achieved, everything I had fought for meant nothing if the final result was becoming the person who had damaged me beyond repair. I looked in the mirror and saw my mother. That was the night I finally changed. The night I saw my mother's face in my own reflection marked the end of one life and the uncertain beginning of another. I spent the following days in a state of profound disorientation, examining every choice I had made, every lesson I had taught, every interaction I had shaped over the past months. The architecture of revenge I had constructed so carefully now looked different. Its elegant lines revealed as prison bars, its strategic brilliance exposed as the same pattern of control and manipulation that had defined my mother's approach to family. I had escaped one cage, only to build another, and I had nearly locked Emily inside it with me. I contacted Emily and asked to meet again. She arrived at the coffee shop with the eager energy I had come to expect from her, ready to absorb whatever wisdom I planned to share. But this conversation would be different from all the others. I had rehearsed what I needed to say, though the words still felt clumsy and inadequate for the weight they had to carry. I owe you an apology. I began watching confusion cloud her sharp features. I have been using you, and I did not even realize it until recently. Everything I taught you, all the advice about strength and independence and not needing anyone, it was not really about helping you. It was about hurting your mother. I was shaping you into a weapon against Victoria, turning you into someone who would reject her as completely as I rejected my own family. That is not mentorship. That is exploitation. You deserve better." Emily's confusion transformed into defensiveness, her jaw setting in a way that reminded me painfully of myself at her age. "But everything you taught me was true. They did hurt you. They were cruel and neglectful, and they deserved to suffer for what they did. My mother treated you like garbage. My grandmother was even worse. Why should I not learn from what happened to you?" "Maybe they do deserve consequences," I said carefully. "But you do not deserve to become like them. Or like me if I keep going down this path." I leaned forward, trying to convey something I was only beginning to understand myself. I spent 15 years building revenge. I was so focused on making them pay that I did not notice I was turning into the person who hurt me. The coldness I was teaching you, the isolation. The idea that family means nothing, those are not lessons. They are wounds. I was passing my wounds to you and calling it wisdom. She sat with this for a long moment, her expression cycling through resistance and consideration, and something that might have been relief. "So, what are you saying, that I should forgive them? Go back to being part of that family?" "No. I am saying you get to choose what you do, and it should be your choice, not mine. Not your mother's, not your grandmother's. Yours." I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder I had prepared. "I want to offer you something different. Help with college applications if you want to go that route. A small fund for emergencies, no strings attached. Introductions to people who can open doors for you professionally. But with clear boundaries. I will not be your weapon against your mother. I will not be another person trying to shape you into something useful for my purposes. You get to decide who you become." Emily took the folder, slowly leafing through the documents inside with an expression I could not quite read. When she looked up, something had changed in her eyes. The predatory edge I had cultivated, the hardness I had encouraged, seemed to soften slightly. "This feels different," she said quietly. "It is different. It is support without manipulation. I should have offered this from the beginning." She did not fully understand the shift. She was 19, still learning to read the subtle currents of adult relationships. But she sensed that something dangerous had left the room, that what remained between us was safer than what had been there before. We parted with a hug that felt genuine rather than strategic, and I watched her walk away carrying possibilities rather than weapons. My mother's final visit came 3 days later. She arrived at my apartment looking even more diminished than the last time I had seen her. Her persistent cough, worse, her movements slower, her eyes holding a question she was afraid to ask directly. She sat on my sofa and made small talk about the weather and Victoria's attempts to rebuild, and the apartment she could no longer quite afford. Then she finally reached the point she had been circling. "I was wondering," she said, her voice carrying none of its old command, "if perhaps I might stay here, with you, just for a while until I get back on my feet." She gestured vaguely at my small living room. "I know it is not large. I would not take up much space." The request was enormous, far larger than the modest square footage of my apartment could contain. She was asking me to undo 20 years of carefully constructed distance to welcome into my daily life the woman who had made my childhood a landscape of invisibility. I felt the weight of the decision pressing down on me, the old reflexive anger rising alongside something newer and more complicated. "No," I said, and the word came out gently rather than harshly. "I have spent 20 years building a life without you in it. That was not revenge. It was survival. I cannot undo that now." I met her eyes, making sure she understood. "Not because I hate you anymore. I do not think I do. But because I need to protect the peace I have finally found. Having you here in my space every day, that would cost me something I am not willing to give up." My mother nodded slowly, accepting the answer with what might have been dignity or might have been exhaustion. She was too old to fight, too depleted to argue, too far past the point where her formidable will could bend the world to her preferences. The war that had defined our relationship for 4 decades was finally over-ended, not by victory or surrender, but by mutual recognition that continuing served no one. She left without drama, without recrimination, without the cutting remarks that had once been her primary form of communication. I stood at my window and watched her walk to the car. Victoria had sent a small figure moving slowly through a world that no longer arranged itself around her needs. And standing there watching her go, I felt something unexpected lightness. I had chosen not to take her in, and the choice had come from wisdom rather than vengeance. I had chosen not to weaponize Emily, and that choice had come from strength rather than weakness. The cycle that had run through my grandmother to my mother to me, the pattern of damaged people damaging others, had come so close to continuing through my actions. But I had seen it in time. I had stopped. The door to my old family was closing probably forever, but doors inside me, doors I had locked so long ago I had forgotten they existed, were beginning to open. Some doors close not from hatred, but from hard-won peace. The peace I had found felt fragile at first, like something that might shatter if I examined it too closely. But as days passed without the constant weight of revenge planning, without the endless strategizing and monitoring that had consumed my thoughts for 15 years, I began to trust that the lightness was real. The doors inside me that had started to open were letting in air I had forgotten existed. I could breathe in ways I had not breathed since childhood, before I learned that survival required holding my breath and waiting for the next blow to land. But there was one final piece of business that needed attending. My mother was still out there living in reduced circumstances, struggling with health issues and limited resources. I had refused to take her in, and I did not regret that decision. But leaving her to suffer completely felt like a hook that would remain embedded in my conscience, a connection that would tug at me whenever I tried to move forward. I needed to resolve this in a way that freed us both. I contacted my lawyer and arranged for a modest monthly stipend to be sent to my mother through channels that would never reveal the source. The amount was enough to cover basic needs: rent for a small apartment, medication for her declining health, food and utilities, and the small comforts that make the difference between surviving and living. The payments would arrive from a trust administered by the law firm with no return address, no conditions attached, no opportunity for my mother to manipulate the arrangement or perform gratitude that would obligate me to respond. She would receive the money and nothing else. No contact, no relationship. Just anonymous support that would continue for as long as she lived. Through my network of connections, I learned that my father had made similar arrangements from his pension. The man who had been too weak to protect me, who had hidden his small act of support in secret accounts and whispered apologies, was now quietly providing for the woman who had controlled him for 40 years. Two people who had failed their daughter in profound ways were now supporting the woman who had failed everyone. There was something almost poetic in the symmetry, though poetry seemed like too elegant a word for the messy reality of our broken family. I wanted to be clear with myself about what this stipend represented. It was not forgiveness. I had not forgiven my mother for the childhood she stole from me, for the decades of feeling invisible and worthless, for the systematic erasure that had shaped me into someone who needed 15 years to learn how to feel. Forgiveness might come someday, or it might not. I could not force it, and I had stopped trying. What the stipend represented was something different: release. I did not want to think about my mother struggling in some dingy apartment, unable to afford medication, choosing between food and electricity. Not because I loved her, or because I felt she deserved comfort, but because those thoughts would occupy space in my mind that I needed for other things. I did not want to feel guilty if she suffered, not because her suffering would be unjust, but because guilt was another form of connection, another tie binding me to a relationship I needed to leave behind. By providing for her basic needs, I was buying my own freedom. No future pleas for help would reach me because she would not need help. No deathbed guilt trips would land because I would have done what I could. No hooks would remain in my heart because I was removing them myself one by one with the surgical precision Eleanor had taught me to apply to every problem. The money was the final transaction in a relationship that had always been transactional. My mother had never given me love freely. She had withheld it as punishment and dispensed it as reward, using affection as currency in an economy I had never understood. Now I was using actual currency to close out the account. The balance would be zero. The ledger would be closed. We would owe each other nothing. I wrote a letter to be delivered with the first payment. The words came slowly, each sentence weighed and measured, stripped of emotion that might invite response. This is all I can give, not because I cannot afford more. You know by now what I built and what I have, but because more would suggest a relationship we do not have. Accept this as my goodbye. I wish you peace in whatever time remains. I wish you comfort and care and whatever healing is possible at this late stage. I am not angry anymore. The anger burned itself out somewhere along the way, and what remains is just exhaustion and a desire to move forward. I am finished, not with life, just with this, with us, with whatever we were supposed to be and never managed to become. I did not sign the letter. I did not need to. My mother would recognize the voice, would understand who had arranged for her support, would know that the daughter she had dismissed as worthless had become someone capable of this final gesture. And knowing perhaps would be its own kind of closure. Not the closure of reconciliation or forgiveness, but the closure of accounts settled, and books closed, and doors that would not open again. The lawyer confirmed that the first payment had been sent. I imagined my mother receiving the envelope, reading the unsigned letter, understanding at last the full scope of what I had become and what she had lost. I hoped she would accept the help without trying to trace its source, without attempting to re-establish contact, without interpreting the stipend as an invitation to relationship. But even if she did reach out, I would not respond. The door was closed. The final word had been spoken. Whatever happened next was not my responsibility. That night I slept more deeply than I had in months. No dreams of the old house with its small back bedroom and its atmosphere of judgment. No imaginary confrontations with ghosts who refused to stay buried. No revenge fantasies playing out in elaborate detail. No guilt spirals pulling me down into darkness. Just rest. Deep, dreamless, healing rest. When I woke, the sunrise through my window looked different. Not brighter exactly, but cleaner. Like a window that had accumulated years of grime without anyone noticing, finally washed to reveal the view that had always been there. The past was not healed. It would never be fully healed. Some wounds leave scars that remain sensitive, forever aching when the weather changes, reminding you of old injuries even as you build new strength. But the past was behind me now. I had done what I needed to do, said what I needed to say, given what I could give and withheld what I could not. I was ready finally to see what lay ahead. It was not mercy. It was not forgiveness. It was my final goodbye and the first step forward. The first step forward became many steps, then miles, then a journey I had never planned but found myself walking anyway. A year passed from the morning I woke to that clean sunrise, and in that year everything about my life transformed in ways I could not have predicted when I was consumed by revenge. The woman who emerged from 12 months of deliberate reconstruction bore little resemblance to the one who had orchestrated her family's destruction. She was quieter, softer in some ways, stronger in others. And for the first time in her adult life, she was building something that had nothing to do with the people who had hurt her. I sold most of my strategic holdings during those months, divesting myself of positions I had accumulated over a decade of careful planning. The network of influence I had woven through my family's ecosystem dissolved as I liquidated stakes in suppliers and banks and hotel chains. Some of those sales generated substantial profits. Others I let go at a loss because the freedom of release mattered more than maximizing returns. The investment game that had consumed my 30s no longer held any appeal. I retained enough capital to live comfortably without excess, to never worry about basic needs, to have options without being enslaved to multiplication. The rest I directed toward purposes that would have mystified the woman I used to be. The city apartment that had served as my base of operations for 15 years began to feel like a costume I had outgrown. I had lived there as Sabrina Ortiz, the invisible failure, and as SM Vance, the strategic mastermind, but neither of those identities fit anymore. I needed new walls that held no memories of revenge plotting, no echoes of sleepless nights spent monitoring my family's destruction. I found what I was looking for in a small coastal town 3 hours from anywhere I had ever lived, a place where no one knew my name or my history or the complicated legacy I carried. The cottage sat within walking distance of the ocean, a modest structure with white walls and blue shutters and a garden that had been neglected by previous owners, but showed potential for someone willing to invest time and care. I bought it with cash and spent weeks making it mine, choosing furniture that felt comfortable rather than strategic hanging art that I actually liked, rather than pieces selected to project a particular image. Simple. Quiet. Entirely my own. For the first time in my life, I lived in a space that had been shaped by nothing but my own preferences. The Eleanor Vance Foundation grew from an idea I had carried since my mentor's death into something real and operational. I established it as a scholarship fund for young women from difficult family backgrounds, the daughters and nieces and granddaughters of dysfunction who were trying to escape patterns that had shaped them since birth. But the foundation offered more than money. It provided mentorship connections, the kind of support system Eleanor had once given me when I was a desperate young woman with nothing but determination and wounds. I interviewed applicants personally, traveling to meet them in coffee shops and libraries and the neutral territories where people share secrets they cannot tell family. I learned to recognize the fire I was looking for, the particular set of the jaw, the determined gaze that comes from being underestimated, the combination of hunger and hurt that could become either armor or anchors depending on how it was channeled. These young women carried wounds that mirrored my own damage inflicted by people who should have protected them. Scars that would never fully disappear, but could be transformed into something useful. I helped them choose armor. Real armor, not the brittle kind that isolates. Not the walls I had built, that kept out pain and connection equally, but resilient protection that could absorb blows while still allowing light through. The friendships that emerged surprised me more than anything else. For 2 decades, every relationship I formed had been strategic, calculated for advantage, evaluated based on what the other person could provide or become. I had no practice at connection for its own sake, no experience with people who wanted nothing from me except company. The learning curve was steep. I made mistakes offering help when sympathy was needed, calculating when I should have simply felt. But the women I met in my coastal town were patient with my peculiarities, accepting my history when I finally shared it, embracing my flaws as part of a complicated whole rather than defects to be corrected. I learned to receive without suspicion, to accept invitations without analyzing ulterior motives. I learned to share stories without calculating their impact, to laugh at jokes that had no tactical purpose, to spend entire evenings discussing nothing more significant than books and weather and the particular way the light hit the ocean at sunset. The woman who had spent 15 years treating every human interaction as a transaction discovered that some exchanges were valuable precisely because they could not be measured. Emily visited occasionally, making the drive from wherever her own journey had taken her to spend weekends in my cottage by the sea. Our relationship had evolved into something careful and boundaried, but genuine, stripped of the manipulation that had poisoned its beginning. She was finding her own path now, making her own mistakes, becoming someone neither her mother nor her grandmother would have predicted. We did not talk about Victoria or Margaret unless Emily needed to process something, unless the past demanded attention. Mostly we talked about the future. Her plans, her hopes, the person she was choosing to become, rather than the one she had been shaped to be. It was strange having something to look forward to rather than something to escape. For so long, my entire existence had been oriented toward the past, avenging old wounds, correcting historical injustices, making people pay for what they had done decades ago. Now I found myself thinking about tomorrow, next month, next year, the foundation's expansion, the garden I wanted to plant in spring, the trips I might take to places I had never seen. The future had transformed from an abstraction into something tangible, something I could hold and shape and anticipate with something approaching excitement. Freedom tasted strange at first, like a language I had forgotten, like food from a country I had left as a child and only remembered in fragments. But my tongue was learning. The language of freedom became more fluent with practice, and as months passed in my coastal cottage, I found myself craving one final act of alignment. There was a name I had carried since birth that no longer fit a surname that connected me to people I had spent decades trying to escape. Every time I signed documents or introduced myself, or saw my name printed on official correspondence, I felt a small jolt of disconnection, as if wearing clothes that belonged to someone else. The woman I had become deserved a name that reflected who she was, rather than who she had been born to. The county courthouse in the nearest large town was a building I had never entered before, a place with no memories attached, no history to navigate. I arrived on a Tuesday morning with a folder of completed paperwork, having researched the legal requirements weeks earlier, and assembled everything needed for a straightforward name change petition. The clerk who processed my application was a middle-aged woman with efficient movements and a disinterested expression that suggested she had handled thousands of similar requests. She did not ask why I wanted to change my name. She did not inquire about the significance of the surname I had chosen. To her, it was just paperwork, another file to be processed and stamped and forwarded to the appropriate office. To me, it was the official end of a journey that had consumed most of my adult life. I signed the final document with deliberate care, watching the pen form letters that would transform my legal identity. Sabrina Ortiz, the name I had carried for 38 years, the name that appeared in family photos where I stood at the edges, the name my mother had spoken with disappointment and my sister had pronounced with contempt. That name would cease to exist when the paperwork was processed. In its place would be Sabrina Vance, a name I had chosen rather than inherited, a name that honored the woman who had saved my life, rather than the family that had tried to erase it. Eleanor Vance had given me everything that mattered: knowledge, opportunity, belief, the tools to build something from nothing. Taking her name felt like the most appropriate tribute I could offer, a permanent acknowledgement that the person I had become owed more to her than to anyone who shared my blood. The clerk filed my papers without ceremony, told me the process would take several weeks, and called the next person in line. I walked out of the courthouse feeling something shift inside me, some final piece sliding into place after years of misalignment. I did not announce the change to anyone. The transformation was too personal, too significant, to be reduced to social media posts or dramatic revelations. Those who needed to know were informed through proper channels. My bank received updated documentation. The foundation's legal records were amended. My small circle of friends learned gradually through natural conversation. Victoria would not know unless she searched for her sister and found the trail of bureaucratic breadcrumbs leading to a new identity. My mother, growing frailer with each passing month, would likely never look. The name change was not a dramatic gesture or a statement designed to wound. It was simply alignment making official what had been true in my heart for years. I belonged to myself now. The documents finally reflected that reality. The day after the courthouse visit, I drove 3 hours to a cemetery I had not visited in 5 years. Eleanor's grave occupied a quiet corner beneath an old oak tree, the headstone modest and elegant, exactly as she would have wanted. I had not returned since her funeral, had avoided this place, because visiting would have required confronting emotions I was not ready to feel. But now, carrying her name legally for the first time, I needed to tell her what had happened. I placed flowers against the headstone and sat on the grass beside it, heedless of the dampness seeping through my clothes. The cemetery was nearly empty, just a few distant figures moving among the stones, no one close enough to hear me speak. "I took your name," I said aloud, addressing the carved letters as if they could transmit my words to wherever she had gone. "I hope that is okay. I hope I am worthy of it." The words felt strange emerging into open air, but I continued anyway. "So much has happened since you left. I built everything you taught me to build. The empire, the positions, the invisible web of influence. and then I used it. I destroyed them, Eleanor. My mother, my sister, everyone who hurt me. I watched them lose everything, and I thought it would feel like victory. A bird called somewhere in the oak branches above me. I waited until the sound faded before continuing. But you were right. You warned me in your letter, and I almost did not listen in time. Hatred almost poisoned what I built. I almost became exactly like her passing wounds to the next generation, confusing cruelty with strength. I was turning my niece into a weapon without even realizing what I was doing. I paused, gathering words for what came next. But I caught it. I stopped. I saw myself in the mirror and finally understood what you meant about coming out richer in peace, not just money. I told her everything, then the whole story pouring out in fragments and tangents, the revenge and the emptiness, and the discovery that Victoria had been a prisoner too, and the mother who finally apologized, and the choice to close doors from wisdom rather than hatred. I told her about the foundation that bore her name, about the young women I was helping, about the cottage by the ocean, and the friendships that still surprised me with their uncomplicated warmth. You would have been proud, I said finally. I think I am proud too. For the first time in my life, I am proud of who I am becoming rather than ashamed of who I was. I sat with her for another hour, saying nothing, simply being present in a place that held the remains of the woman who had changed everything. When I finally stood to leave, brushing grass from my clothes, I felt neither heavy nor light. I felt present. Here now in this moment, in this body, in this life, I was finally making my own. Walking back to my car, I noticed details I might have missed before: the way sunlight filtered through leaves, the texture of gravel beneath my feet, the particular blue of the sky on this ordinary Tuesday afternoon. The past had happened. The wounds were real, and would remain real scars that would ache sometimes when the weather changed. But they were not my whole story anymore. I was not the forgotten daughter, or the revenge architect, or the almost monster who had nearly continued a cycle of generational destruction. I was Sabrina Vance. I was 38 years old, and I was just beginning. I was not reborn. I chose myself for the first time in my life. Choosing myself was only the beginning of understanding who that self actually was. The name change had aligned my external identity with my internal transformation, but beneath the surface questions remained that I could not answer alone. I had spent 15 years building revenge and nearly a year dismantling its aftermath, but I still did not fully understand how I had come so close to becoming the person I had fought against. That gap in understanding gnawed at me until I finally admitted I needed help to bridge it. The therapist's office occupied a quiet corner of a converted Victorian house in a town 20 miles from my cottage. Dr. Margaret Chen was a woman about Eleanor's age with silver-streaked hair and the particular stillness of someone who has spent decades listening to pain. She specialized in trauma and family systems, in the invisible patterns that pass from generation to generation like genetic code for suffering. I chose her after researching extensively, looking for someone who would understand the complexity of what I needed to explore. I need to know why I almost became her. I told Dr. Chen during our first session, the words tumbling out with an urgency I had not expected. I did everything right. I escaped. I built something from nothing. I succeeded beyond anything my family thought possible. But I still nearly turned into the thing I was running from. I was shaping my niece into a weapon. I was teaching her the same cold isolation my mother taught me. How is that possible? How can you escape something and still carry it with you? The answer unfolded over months of weekly sessions, each conversation peeling back another layer of understanding. Survival patterns, Dr. Chen explained, do not disappear simply because the threat has passed. They hide in the architecture of the self, embedded so deeply they become invisible. They wait patient as seeds for conditions that trigger their emergence. The defenses I had built to survive my childhood had been essential at the time, the only tools available to a girl who needed to protect herself from people who should have loved her. But those same defenses had calcified into something dangerous, walls so high and thick that they kept out not just pain, but the possibility of genuine connection. You learned that love was conditional, that family meant obligation without affection, that softness was weakness, Dr. Chen said during one of our sessions. Those lessons kept you alive, but they were never supposed to be permanent. Survival strategies become prisons when we can no longer distinguish between then and now, between the threat that was real and the safety that exists today. The hardest work was not understanding my past, but forgiving myself for how I had responded to it. I had carried hatred for so long that it had become part of my identity, a constant companion that motivated and sustained me through years of patient construction. Dr. Chen helped me see that the hatred had served a purpose. "It makes sense that you hated them," she said. "Hatred was protective. It kept you moving forward when you had nothing else. It gave you energy when grief would have paralyzed you. It provided structure when chaos threatened to overwhelm." She paused, letting the words settle. But protective emotions become prisons if they are never released. You can acknowledge that hatred served you without allowing it to continue defining you. I learned to hold two truths simultaneously, a skill that had seemed impossible when I began therapy, but gradually became natural through practice. What they did was wrong, and I survived. I had the right to be angry about my childhood, and I did not have to stay angry forever. The wounds were real, and they did not have to determine my future. Freedom, I discovered, was not the absence of wounds. It was the ability to carry them without being crushed, to walk forward even when the scars ached, to build something new on ground that had once been salted with pain. Dr. Chen suggested an exercise that I resisted for weeks before finally attempting it. She asked me to write letters. I would never send one to each person who had shaped my story: my mother, my father, Victoria, and the girl I had been before everything went wrong. The letters were meant to hold everything I had never said, every feeling I had suppressed or channeled into revenge, every word that had remained trapped in my throat for decades. I wrote them over several nights, each letter harder than the last. To my mother, I wrote about the anger that had sustained me, and the grief that had hidden beneath it, the moments of hatred so intense they had frightened me, the unexpected compassion that had grown in their place when I learned about her own suffering. To my father, I wrote about disappointment, and the strange gratitude I felt for his secret support, the wish that he had been stronger, and the acceptance that he was not. To Victoria, I wrote about the years of resentment, and the revelation that she had been a prisoner, two different cage, but same jailer. To my younger self, I wrote words of comfort. I had never received promises that things would get better, assurances that she was worth loving, even when no one seemed to notice. When I finished, I took the letters to the beach at sunset. The ocean stretched before me, vast and in different waves, continuing their eternal rhythm, regardless of human suffering. I burned the letters one by one, watching the paper curl and blacken, watching my words transform into smoke and ash. The ashes scattered over water that did not care about my pain, that had existed for millions of years before I was born and would exist for millions more after I was gone. That indifference was somehow comforting. The ocean put everything in perspective. My suffering was real, but it was not the center of the universe. The world continued regardless. That night, for the first time in 30 years, I slept without dreaming of the house. No locked doors appeared in my unconscious mind. No cold hallways stretched endlessly before me. No small bedroom with the smallest window trapped me in memories of loneliness. Just rest. Deep and dreamless and free, the kind of sleep I had not experienced since before I understood that my family did not love me. When I woke the next morning, I did not remember the absence of nightmares. I simply felt rested, normal, like someone whose past was genuinely past, stored in memory rather than living in the present. I made coffee in my small kitchen, carried it to the window that faced the ocean, and watched the morning light spread across the water. Then I started a new day. That was all. That was everything. Forgiveness is not a gift you give others. It is a weight you finally set down. The weight I set down stayed down. 5 years passed from that morning on the beach, 5 years of ordinary days accumulating into an extraordinary life, and I found myself sitting in the garden of my coastal cottage, watching morning fog retreat from the water with a cup of coffee warming my hands. I was 42 years old now, my hair showing early gray that I did not bother hiding, my face marked by laugh lines I had earned through actual laughter rather than performance. The woman who had once built invisible empires had become someone who tended roses and mentored young women and found contentment in rhythms so simple they would have seemed impossible to the person I used to be. Emily was visiting this weekend, fresh from her college graduation, full of plans and possibilities that I loved hearing about. She had become someone neither her mother nor grandmother could have predicted, confident, without cruelty, ambitious without ruthlessness, independent without isolation. The foundation I had built in Eleanor's name had helped 47 young women so far, and I knew each of their names, remembered each of their stories, celebrated each of their successes as if they were my own. In a way, they were. Every woman who escaped a toxic family and built something better was proof that the cycle could be broken. A letter arrived that afternoon from a law firm I recognized, one of several that had handled various final details over the years. I opened it expecting routine correspondence about accounts or documentation. What I found instead was news I had known would come eventually but had not prepared for. My mother had passed away. The death was peaceful at home during sleep. Victoria had been with her at the end. The arrangements were already being made. My presence was not expected. I held that letter for a long time, sitting in my garden with the paper growing warm in my hands, waiting to feel something definite. The emotions that arrived were quieter than I had anticipated. Not grief exactly, though something adjacent to grief moved through me. Not relief exactly, though something like relief was present too. What I felt most was completion. A door that had already been closed for years had now been locked. The key could finally be thrown away. I did not attend the funeral. I had not spoken to Victoria directly in 4 years, and appearing at our mother's memorial would have transformed the occasion into something other than what it needed to be. But I sent flowers without a card, an anonymous gesture that Victoria would likely recognize anyway. Emily called afterward, describing the small service, the handful of attendees, the closed chapter in our family's complicated history. "Grandma asked about you at the end," Emily said, her voice careful over the phone. "She wanted to know if you were happy." The question stopped me for a moment. Was I happy? The word felt too simple, too small for what I had built. I was not happy in the giddy, uncomplicated way that word usually implied. I still carried scars that ached sometimes when the weather changed. I still had nights when old memories surfaced unexpectedly, but I was something better than happy. I was whole. "Tell them I am okay," I said finally. "Tell them I am more than okay." Weeks later, another letter arrived, this one unexpected. Victoria's handwriting on the envelope made me hesitate before opening it, the first direct communication between us in years. The letter inside was short, surprising in its warmth, written with a vulnerability I had never seen from my sister before. "I am sorry for everything," she wrote. "I understand now what it cost you to stop the cycle. I am trying to do the same with Emily, though I started much later than you. Thank you for giving her what I could not. I do not expect a response. I just wanted you to know I see you now. Finally, after all these years, I see you." I read the letter twice, absorbing words I had never expected to receive. Then I folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer. I did not respond, but I did not throw it away either. Some things deserve to be kept, even when they cannot be answered. Evening came, and I walked to the beach as I did most nights, following the familiar path through seagrass to sand still warm from the day's sun. I watched the sunset paint the water in shades of orange and gold and deep purple, the horizon stretching forever in every direction. I did not think about my mother or Victoria or the house I had lost or the empire I had built and then released. I thought about tomorrow, the foundation meeting scheduled for the morning, the lunch planned with a new scholarship recipient, the book waiting on my nightstand half finished. The ordinary pleasures of an ordinary day. I was not rich anymore, not by the standards I had once achieved. The strategic holdings and shell companies and invisible networks had been dismantled years ago. But I owned something that all that money and power could never have purchased: my own life, lived on my own terms, free from the chains I had once worn and the chains I had almost created for others. I had broken a cycle that ran through generations of my family, and the breaking had cost me everything and given me everything in return. I no longer needed buildings or revenge or anyone's approval. I finally owned the only thing that ever mattered: my life. And that, after everything, was enough. And that is the story of how I went from the forgotten daughter standing at the edge of family photos to the woman who finally owns her own life. It took 15 years of building, months of destruction, and years of healing to understand that the greatest victory was never about revenge. It was about breaking free. If this story touched something in you, if you recognized pieces of yourself in Sabrina's journey, or if you know someone who needs to hear that they are worth more than the family that forgot them, please share this video. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to life. I would love to hear from you in the comments below. Have you ever had to walk away from family to find yourself? Do you believe Sabrina made the right choice in the end? What would you have done differently? Every comment, every share, every subscription tells us that these stories matter and encourages us to keep creating content that speaks to real experiences and real emotions. If you have not already, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss another story. We post new content every week, and your support means the world to us. Thank you for staying until the end. Until next time, remember, you are not defined by where you came from. You are defined by who you choose to become.